Kidnapping Lord Blaymire. Written and narrated by Catherine Bilson. Prologue. Kinnerton Tower, Lancashire, late October, 1820. "Another letter for you, miss." Persephone froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. The housekeeper, Mrs. Conkle, set the folded paper down on the table beside her bowl of porridge. Mouth pursed disapprovingly, she stared at Persephone. "Letter? I don't see any letter." Deliberately, Persephone picked up the folded newspaper and moved it towards her, covering the letter up. "You didn't see any letter either, did you, Mrs. Conkle?" "No good comes of hiding from your troubles," the housekeeper muttered darkly. She turned and left the room, leaving Persephone alone. With the letter. She could almost feel it, crouching beneath the newspaper, like a predator waiting to pounce. I'm being ridiculous. It's merely a piece of paper sealed with wax. Pushing the newspaper off, she picked up the letter and broke the embossed seal, unfolding the single sheet of expensive vellum. This was far from the first of these letters she had received. They had begun arriving after her uncle passed away a little less than a year ago. The first had been a mere polite note of condolence. The second, advising her that nothing need change about her situation until her 6 months of official mourning were over. The third letter had changed everything. It had been a summons to London, one which brooked no argument and offered no alternative. Since Lord Blaymire had inherited her guardianship, along with all of his uncle's property, Persephone supposed that she should have followed his instructions immediately. London was the very last place she wanted to be, however. She had disliked it intensely during her single abortive season 7 years earlier, and she had no desire to return now. At almost 25, she was far too old to be entering the marriage mart, even if she had wanted a husband, which she rather thought she did not. Every 2 weeks since, another letter had arrived, the tone growing increasingly querulous and impatient, inquiring why he had not received a response from her. Demanding to know why she had not yet presented herself at Blaymire House in Grosvenor Square. This letter was the 8th. It differed from the previous correspondence only in that a slight glimmer of awareness seemed to have come to the writer that it might not be quite as simple to follow his orders as he had assumed. This letter queried whether she required funds to make the journey, and advised that, upon presenting herself at the nearest stagecoach stop, she would be provided with tickets sufficient to convey her to London. Persephone snorted aloud, and then she rose to her feet, crossed to the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, and fed the paper to the flames. In 8 more weeks, none of this would matter. She need not receive any of Lord Blaymire's correspondence, need not trouble herself about his arrogant demands and assumptions. In 8 more weeks, Persephone Patten would be 25 years old, and in possession of her own inheritance of £5,000. God willing, a few days after that, she would board a ship bound for America, where she intended to begin an entirely new life. Chapter 1. London. A few days later. "And this is Lady Elizabeth St. Clair," Lady Blaymire addressed her son, with a strong note of approval in her voice. "Lady Elizabeth is the Marquess of Chermond's daughter." Lady Elizabeth was the 5th, or perhaps the 6th, young lady his mother had introduced that evening. All of them were pretty, demure, and exceedingly well-bred. Samuel Mather-Curtin, Lord Blaymire, didn't want to dance with any of them. Despite his mother's unsubtle hints and the inviting glances being cast his way from the young ladies, he didn't want to be in Almack's at all, drinking weak lemonade and being paraded around like a prize bull at the county fair. Lady Elizabeth was eyeing him from behind her fan, rather as though she might ask to inspect his teeth at any moment. Does one inspect the teeth of bulls, or is that only horses? Samuel diverted himself briefly in wondering about it. Long enough for the silence to stretch out awkwardly, and his mother to start tapping her foot impatiently. "Samuel!" Lady Blaymire hissed from the corner of her mouth before swaying into him and giving him a sharp poke in the ribs with her folded fan. "Ask Lady Elizabeth to dance." He suppressed a sigh, bowing politely. "Are you engaged for the next dance, my lady?" "How kind of you to ask, Lord Blaymire, and no, I am not." She laid a slender, white-gloved hand on his offered arm and proceeded with him to the dance floor. Lady Elizabeth was exactly the sort of woman he should marry, Samuel supposed. Pretty, poised, titled, presumably with a healthy dowry. She was everything a man could want in a wife. She danced elegantly, but when he tried to converse with her, find out what interests she might have, she seemed to have nothing to say. He would be bored out of his mind within a week married to someone like Lady Elizabeth, however suitable she might be in the eyes of society. More bored than he currently was, which was truly saying something, because Samuel had struggled to find anything to interest him in the diversions of the ton for the last couple of years. Since inheriting his title 6 years ago at the age of 22, he had slowly come to hold in contempt his contemporaries, who whiled away their time and frittered away their fortunes, gambling and drinking. "They look quite charming together," his mother was saying to the Marchioness of Chermond, as Samuel escorted Lady Elizabeth off the dance floor. "You must come to our grand Christmas ball, Lady Chermond. I am sending out invitations next week." "You are very kind, Lady Blaymire. I am sure we will be delighted," the Marchioness gushed. "Won't we, Elizabeth?" "Indeed, Mamma. A great honour," Lady Elizabeth murmured, with her pretty, polite smile. "It is quite settled, then," Lady Blaymire said with a broad smile. Samuel thought that if left to the three of them, the announcement of his engagement to Lady Elizabeth would probably be the crowning highlight of the Christmas ball. "Pray excuse me," he murmured, suddenly unable to bear any more of the crush in the hot, crowded room. Offering a minimal bow to the Chermond ladies, he made his way outside, turning his face up to the cold, dark night once he was free of the stifling assembly rooms. He breathed deeply. He needed to get out of London. Perhaps he should go to Blaymire Castle for a few days, see how the building works were progressing. His barony was an ancient one, the family seat a castle in Shropshire dating back to the Middle Ages. The place was barely habitable in the winter, which was why they always spent Christmas in London, but Samuel loved his home. 5 years ago, he had begun works on the castle, determined to repair it and make it habitable by modern standards. Another year or two of reconstruction, and it might even be possible to live there year-round, which would suit Samuel admirably. He would be perfectly happy never to have to visit London again. Of course, this was another reason why choosing one of the Ton's débutantes for a wife would not turn out well. Such a wife would want the social whirl of the season. She would not welcome rusticating in an ancient pile far away on the Welsh border. Sighing again, Samuel started down the stairs, waving off his man, who approached to ask if he would like his coach brought around. "No, stay and bring my mother home when she's ready." "I'll walk." It was less than a mile from King Street to Grosvenor Square. Even though a light rain began to fall as he walked, he felt as though he could breathe for the first time that day. London's smoke-filled air was a poor substitute for the clean country air he longed for, but it would have to do. The carriage arrived as he was mounting the front steps of his townhouse. With a sigh, Samuel reversed course and opened the door for his mother, who promptly smacked him across the knuckles with her fan and began to berate him for abandoning her. "Abandoned? Such dramatics, mother," he said dryly, nevertheless offering his arm to escort her up the stairs. "I do not know what is wrong with you young people these days," Lady Blaymire declared crossly. "When I was your age, all I wanted was to be in London, attending parties and balls. Between you and the Pattern Girl, one would think it the most horrible place in the world." "Has Miss Patten written back?" Samuel asked with interest as they entered the house. "She has not, and I cannot account for it. She is your ward, Samuel, and I absolutely must have her here in time for the Christmas ball, so that I may bring her out. My friends are asking why she is not here already." "Perhaps you should not have told them you would be bringing her out until you actually had her here," he said, and was treated to a scowl for his troubles. "Perhaps you should do your duty by the girl and get her here." "I can hardly have her dragged to London by her hair, Mother. She is not long out of mourning. Give her time." "You are too soft by half. Your uncle died 8 months ago, and he was not even her blood relative." Lady Blaymire pursed her lips. "I told him to send the girl here years ago when his wife passed, but he would have none of it. Said he and the chit rubbed along well together. Highly inappropriate, if you ask me." Samuel did not comment that his uncle had not, in fact, asked her. His father's younger brother, Matthew, had been something of an eccentric, taking up residence in a remote family holding on the Lancashire coast called Kidnapping Tower, where he wrote obscure but passionate treatises about seabirds on the Irish Sea. It had surprised the entire family when he'd married quite well, the daughter of a local squire. The squire's other daughter had married the local member for Parliament, Albert Patten. It was Patten's daughter who, since the death of her parents 6 years ago, had made her home in Kidnapping Tower, first with Matthew and his wife, and, after her aunt's passing, just Matthew. Matthew's death meant everything he possessed returned to his heir, his nephew, Samuel, including the guardianship of a girl Samuel had never even met. Lady Blaymire had immediately advised him that she was happy to take the girl under her wing, which Samuel did not doubt. He had never seen his mother happier than the years in which she'd had daughters to bring out, but now that Samuel's 6 sisters were all married off, she needed a new distraction. With Samuel himself resisting her efforts to see him married, Miss Patten should provide just the ticket, so he supposed he should exert himself and have the girl brought to London. "I shall look into it tomorrow, Mother," he promised. She released his arm with a regal nod. "See that you do." "Good morning, Mr. Hallam." Striding into the study after breaking his fast the following morning, Samuel nodded to his secretary. "Lord Blaymire?" Hallam was a small man with an unfortunately high and nasal voice, but his efficiency was undoubted. He essayed a polite little bow without rising from his chair or disturbing the neat stacks of paper arrayed on the desk before him. "I thought we might start with the question of the factory in Birmingham, my lord." "Before we do, I have another query. Miss Patten." Hallam stared at him uncomprehendingly. "Who, my lord?" "Miss Patten. The young lady who was residing with my uncle at Kidnapping Tower, now my ward." "Oh, of course." Hallam nodded. "I recall now. Your mother invited her to London, did she not? Is all prepared for her visit?" "I believe so, but I needed to check with you. How many letters have you dispatched, and have you received any responses?" Mr. Hallam blinked. "I will consult my files of correspondence, my lord." Samuel arched a brow and waited. Now, yes, of course." Abandoning the factory paperwork, Mr. Hallam moved to the large bureau where he managed all correspondence he sent and received on Samuel's behalf, and consulted a large ledger. "I have sent Miss Patten 8 letters in your name, my lord. Just 1 has been received in return." He presented a folded sheet of paper. Miss Patten had a neat, precise hand, and she was certainly economical with her words, Samuel thought, as he read the brief note over. Miss Patten expressed polite thanks for condolences extended on the passing of her uncle, and stated that she intended to remain secluded at Kidnapping Tower for the duration of her mourning. "This is dated more than 6 months ago," Samuel noted. "We have received no word from her since." "No, my lord."
I sent a courtesy letter every few months, requesting that she let us know if she should require any money or assistance, until 6 months had passed since Mr. Mather Curtin's death. At which point Lady Blaymire instructed me to write to Miss Patten and request her presence in London.
Mr. Hallam looked concerned.
Do you find Miss Patten's silence concerning, my lord? I must admit I assumed she had merely chosen to extend her period of mourning. Should I dispatch a man to Lancashire to investigate?
He should say yes. Should let Hallam deal with it in his customary efficient manner. No doubt Miss Patten would be arriving in London bag and baggage within a fortnight. Instead, Samuel found himself saying, "No, Hallam. I believe I shall deal with the matter personally."
I do beg your pardon, my lord.
Hallam blinked at him inquisitively. "I've been considering a visit to Blaymire Castle to see how the building works progress. I'll make a detour to Kidnapping Tower, meet with Miss Patten myself. She's my ward, after all. I should meet her."
"That's quite a detour, my lord. 'Tis nigh on 100 miles between the two, and this late in the year the roads will be turning foul."
"I shan't melt in a little rain, Hallam." Energised by the notion of leaving London for a little while, Samuel tossed Miss Patten's note onto the desk. "Do as you see fit on the Birmingham matter. I shall keep you informed as to my movements."
"Very good, my lord,"
was the only response Hallam made as Samuel strode from the room, calling for his valet to pack a bag. Chapter 2. Kidnapping Tower, Lancashire. 10 days later. Tired and distinctly damp from the light rain, Samuel urged his weary horse up the slope with a gentle murmur of encouragement. He had paused in the small town of Hurstmouth an hour hence to take a meal, and he'd been advised that Kidnapping Tower was only 4 miles distant, on the other side of the headland his weary horse was presently struggling to climb. Finally cresting the hill, Samuel cursed under his breath as the brisk wind blew a heavier splatter of rain straight into his face. Wiping his eyes with his sleeve, he saw grey stone before him and realised his information was correct. This must indeed be Kidnapping Tower. The tower was 4 stories high, he judged, and it had once been a watchtower against Irish raiders. In recent years the building had been added to in order to make it more habitable, with a pair of single-story stone wings extending out to form an L shape with the tower itself at the corner. Low walls closed the square, and he saw chickens within the enclosure, as well as to what to his admittedly uninformed eye looked like a healthy vegetable garden. Urging his tired horse onwards, he circled the property almost completely before finally finding what seemed to be the only door at the base of the tower itself. Dismounting and ascending the stone steps, he banged sharply on the heavy, oak-studded door, hoping a servant would be available to care for his horse. "Who is it?" a woman's voice called from inside a few minutes later. "'Tis Lord Blaymire," he said. "Open the door, if you please." There was a gasp, and then, after a long moment, in which he wondered if whoever was inside had even recognised his name, came the squeal of bolts being drawn back, and a loud creaking as the heavy door opened a crack. Samuel found himself looking into wide eyes as stormy grey as the Irish sea at his back, set in a thin, pale face. Dark hair was drawn back in a severe knot, and the woman wore a plain grey woolen dress. A housekeeper, he assessed at a glance. "Good afternoon," he said pleasantly. "Might someone be available to help with my horse?" The woman pursed her lips, but nodded. "We've no stable, but Jacob can put him in the shed and rub him down." Putting her fingers to her lips, she let out a shrill whistle that made Samuel jump, but a moment later a man came shambling around the corner. "Jacob," the woman said, speaking slowly, "take this horse to the shed and rub him with some straw." "Aye, miss," Jacob said, reaching for the horse's reins. "Give him a bucket of water and a scoop of oats in a second bucket," the woman said, and Samuel realised Jacob must be simple-minded. The woman was giving him careful, simple instructions to avoid confusing him. "Thank you, Jacob," he said, relinquishing the reins and getting a nod and a broad smile in return. "Jacob will take good care of him," the woman assured, before pushing the door wider and stepping back. "I suppose you'd better come in." She did not sound particularly welcoming, and Samuel frowned, mildly irritated. The housekeeper must realize this was his property, and that she therefore served at his pleasure. "I did not catch your name, Mrs." He paused, waiting. He doesn't know who I am. For one moment, Persephone considered giving a false name, weaving a fantastical story of being a lowly servant, telling him that Miss Patten was long gone. Almost as soon as the idea came to her, she dismissed it. He would be on the trail like a bloodhound, and just a few questions in Hurstmouth would reveal her true identity, and that was if Jacob didn't let it slip first. Turning her back, giving herself a moment to think over the plan and reconsider its merits, she led Lord Blaymire to the stairwell. Her uncle's study was the only one fit to receive a guest of his stature, of any stature really. Up to the top room of the tower she led him, and opened the study door. "Please, take a seat, my lord. May I hang up your coat?" The fire was unlit, but it only took her a few moments with the flint and steel on the mantel to send a spark into the kindling laid ready for it. Lord Blaymire surveyed her thoughtfully, but he took off his coat and let her take it, hanging it beside the fireplace, where it would dry quickly once the blaze got going. He set his hat on a side table and folded his arms across his chest, a broad chest, she noted, and there was no padding beneath his coat to give him an appearance of musculature where none existed. He was above average height, though not excessively tall, and as he stripped off his gloves, she saw that his hands looked strong. No idle nobleman, as she had imagined him. "Mrs.," he prompted again. "Not Mrs., my lord. Miss. I am Miss Persephone Patten." Lord Blaymire's jaw dropped, his eyebrows swooping upwards. "You," he said, his tone disbelieving. "Indeed, my lord." Wondering why he was so obviously shocked, Persephone settled herself into the chair she had always been accustomed to take when sitting with her uncle. On so many evenings they had sat here, beside the fire, conversing into the small hours. She pushed down another pang of grief and folded her hands on her lap. "Forgive me." Lord Blaymire pushed a hand through his hair, a thick mop of brown curls, a little longer than the current fashion, she thought. "I had thought you to be younger. 18 or so." "I am 24, my lord." Should she mention that her birthday fast approached, tell him that very soon he need not concern himself about her? But he was already speaking again. "Well, that makes it all the more imperative that you must come to London immediately. Mother will be able to help you get settled. Of course, she must know how old you are. That is why she is so insistent." Persephone got the feeling Lord Blaymire was speaking rather more to himself than to her. He's just as arrogant as his letters, she thought, just as careless of my feelings. Telling him she was about to achieve her majority would avail her precisely nothing. He would probably present her with a husband of his choice and order her to marry before her birthday, just to make sure her fortune would remain outside her own control. Still, she would try, would ask him to listen to her. "My lord," she said hesitantly, "I do not wish to go to London." Once he had recovered from his surprise at her appearance, and frankly, his embarrassment at having mistaken her for a servant, Samuel reassessed Miss Patten with a critical eye. Although she was a few years older than he had thought, she was actually very comely, or would be in a pretty dress with her hair coiffed. Those stormy eyes dominated her face, but it was a lovely face with high cheekbones, delicately arched brows, and a pointed little chin. He glanced at her hands folded in her lap, and kicked himself for not noticing them before. She had a lady's hands, with long, elegant fingers. "I regret that I do not see any other option, Miss Patten," he said, not unkindly. "You cannot remain at Kidnapping Tower indefinitely." "Why not?" His brows flew up again. Miss Patten was full of surprises. Her blunt question deserved an answer, however. "It is not a suitable situation. You must wish for a home of your own, a husband and family. Uncle Matthew was a recluse here. You cannot possibly wish to remain." Miss Patten looked away towards the fire. He wondered what she might be thinking. Perhaps she was shy, fearing that she would not fit into the social whirl of London. On that, at least, he could set her mind at rest. "My mother knows everyone in London, and she is all prepared to introduce you to her friends. I am sure she probably already has a list of potential suitors drawn up for you, much as she has a list of heiresses for me to pay court to." "A happy thought, undoubtedly," Miss Patten said, and he wondered if that was sarcasm he detected in her tone. Surely not. "We can suffer the marriage mart together, for you see, I must select a bride sooner rather than later. I can escort you to all the social events, properly chaperoned by my mother, of course." "Happy days indeed," Miss Patten said. "But I hardly think our situation's equal, my lord. I am a nobody who is tenuously connected to your illustrious family and firmly on the shelf by virtue of my age, whereas you are one of London's most eligible bachelors. Have you not already made your selection, besides?" "I do not follow your meaning," Samuel said a little stiffly. "Kidnapping Tower is remote, my lord, but our mutual uncles subscribed to quite a number of newspapers and periodicals, not all of them tending to his scientific interests, and his subscriptions have not lapsed. I read the gossip columns on a regular basis, and it seems all London is saying Lady Elizabeth St. Clair will be your choice. Daughter of the Marquess of Chermond, am I correct?" Samuel gritted his teeth. One dance with Lady Elizabeth, and it seemed his mother must have taken advantage of his absence from London to thoroughly fan the flames of gossip. "It is far from a settled arrangement," he snapped. "Oh?" A delicate dark brow arched sceptically. Angry, Samuel struck out verbally. "What could the gossip columns possibly mean to someone who has never been to London? You would not even know any of the people mentioned in them." "As it happens, my lord, I have been to London. I have even participated in the season, though it was some years ago when I was only 17. I had but half a season before my mother fell ill. Still, I met any number of people whom I recall quite well. Even you, on 2 separate occasions. Though it seems you do not remember either of them." Samuel could not remember ever feeling so off balance on first meeting someone in his entire life. Yet again, Miss Patten had thrown him onto the wrong foot. "I beg your pardon," he said, racking his brain. "Then again, you were quite drunk on the first occasion." He flinched. "Mamma pointed you out, since our families are connected. Brought me over to introduce us. It was at the opera." Miss Patten's nose wrinkled. "Your breath quite stank of brandy, and you slurred something about an opera dancer you had to meet and stumbled off." Good God. Samuel did not know where to put himself. 7 years ago would this have been?" "Indeed, my lord. You had just graduated from Cambridge, I believe." "My father was dying." It was no excuse for such appalling behaviour, but he did recall he had spent most of that winter trying to drink away reality. "I do beg your pardon, though, Miss Patten. That was inexcusable of me." Her expression softened when he mentioned his father, and she waved one of her slender, elegant hands in a graceful gesture. "It was a long time ago, my lord. I took no insult." "You say we met on another occasion?" Samuel tried to recover. "I hope I was not such a bore the second time." Indeed, no. She smiled, and it had an oddly wistful quality to it. It was at a musicale evening. I forget who the host was, but clearly you were being encouraged to pay court to the daughter of the house. The hostess asked you to play the violin while she sang. Oh. He had not played the violin since his father died. They had shared a love of the instrument, and even drawing his bow across the strings had been too painful for Samuel's heart. You played quite beautifully, my lord. I was very moved. So was the hostess's daughter, and a goodly number of her friends. You were very popular, and we did not have the opportunity to speak. Samuel didn't recall the exact occasion of which she spoke, but he was at least slightly mollified that he had not made a complete cake of himself twice before Miss Patten. Once was bad enough, even if she did seem prepared to forgive him for it. The news that she was not completely inexperienced of London was welcome, however. Obviously, she knew how to conduct herself in society, and hopefully she would have no trouble slipping back into it, even if her direct way of speaking might discomfort some men. She was pretty enough, connected with his family, and had a nice little inheritance, if he recalled correctly. Some gentleman who did not mind her plain speaking would snap her up. "Well, it is excellent to hear that you have been to London before," he said bracingly, doing his best to recover after she had thoroughly wrong-footed him with her revelations. "Undoubtedly, you will be remembered by some you have previously encountered, and make plenty of new friends while under my mother's influence." Chapter 3. It was quite clear to Persephone that Lord Blaymire's mind was set. She was going to London, to be handed over to his mother and served up on a platter for the gentlemen of the ton to pick over at their leisure, like a horse at market. She could not think of any prospect more horrible. Her fingers tightened, twisting together until they hurt, and she glanced down. Breathe. Think. "You must think me quite ill-mannered, Lord Blaymire," she said. "I have not so much as offered you a cup of tea or piece of cake. If you will excuse me for a few minutes." "I don't," he started to say, but Persephone bolted to her feet and almost ran from the room. Heart pounding, she raced down the steps and into the house's eastern wing where the kitchen was, and, beyond that, the rooms where Mrs. Conkle and her son Jacob resided. Mrs. Conkle was not present, having taken the pony and cart to market in Hurstmouth to purchase supplies, so Persephone would have to prepare the tea herself, a task to which she was quite accustomed. Swinging the hook holding the iron kettle back over the stove, she stoked the firebox before reaching for teacups and a tray. There was a pound cake wrapped in muslin in the pantry. She cut several slices and put them on a plate. Opening the tea caddy, she paused with the spoon in her hand, a wild idea suddenly coming to her. Slowly she turned her head and stared at the dresser, in particular the neatly arranged jars and packets, each carefully labelled with the names of the herbs and spices she and Mrs. Conkle collected, dried and stored. Maybe, just possibly, Persephone could arrange things so that she needn't go to London after all. Just a few more weeks was all she needed. Just until after her birthday. Spooning some tea into the pot, she replaced the tea caddy and took down a different jar. She would need honey as well to mask the taste, she judged, and added a small pot and a clean spoon to the tray before adding water to the teapot and carrying the tray out of the kitchen and up the stairs. Lord Blaymire looked up with a frown as she re-entered the study, rising to his feet politely. "Tea was not necessary, Miss Patten." "Nonsense," she said briskly, setting down the tray. "We have a great deal to discuss, my lord, and I have no intention of doing so, with a throat becoming increasingly parched. Do try a piece of cake. My housekeeper, Mrs. Conkle, makes an excellent pound cake, and she will be sure to ask if I gave you some, so I pray, do not make a liar of me." He eyed her warily, but took his seat again once she had sat down, and accepted a napkin and a piece of cake. "You take honey in your tea?" "Gentlemen do, in my experience. Uncle was very fond of it, I used to jest that he took tea with his honey. Once again a pang of loss struck her for the kindly old man who had insisted she stay with him, even though they were not blood kin. "Two lost souls keeping each other company," Uncle Matthew had argued, peering at her over the half-moon glasses he'd rarely removed. Knowing how much he must have been missing her aunt, she had not attempted to deny him. "I remember that," Lord Blaymire said unexpectedly. "We never visited here. My uncle claimed Kidnapping Tower was not equipped to receive visitors, but several times he and Aunt Alice came to Blaymire Castle to visit with us. I remember Aunt Alice laughing with my mother, saying that they would have to ask the housekeeper to add a larger honey bowl to the tea tray. My father had the same taste. I like a spoonful of honey, but no more than that." She made it a generous spoonful, pouring the steeped tea carefully through the strainer and stirring the cup gently before passing it to him. He waited until she had her own tea in hand before taking a sip, which she thought quite gentlemanly of him. "Let me see if I have it straight," Lord Blaymire said, and Persephone sighed inwardly, steeling herself to deal with his questions. "When did your father pass on?" "When I was 11. He owned a small estate not too far from here, but it was entailed upon a distant cousin, so Aunt Alice invited Mamma and me to take up residence here. We lived in Kinnerton Cottage, which you can just see from the window there." She gestured at one of the study's narrow windows. Lord Blaymire rose and strolled over to look, taking his teacup with him. "Who lives there now?" he inquired. "Nobody at the present time. It was let to tenants this summer, a family from London, but has been empty since they departed a few weeks ago." The name cottage was something of a misnomer. Kinnerton Cottage was a handsome 4-bedroomed house, larger inside than Kinnerton Tower. Persephone had happy memories of her years residing there with her mother. "And then your mother passed when you were 17? Lord Blaymire turned to look at her, leaning back against the windowsill and sipping from his tea. Persephone pretended to sip at her own. "No, my lord, she fell ill when I was 17, during my season. We returned home for her to recuperate, but she did not recover. She passed a year later." Her teacup rattled in the saucer. "Aunt Alice insisted I move into the tower. I have resided here ever since. When Aunt Alice passed on 2 years ago, it left just myself and Uncle Matthew here." "And then he too died," Lord Blaymire murmured, and Persephone thought she saw pity in his gaze. "You have lost everyone, one after the other." "I do not repine, my lord. I have a roof over my head and food to eat, and while my father's estate was entailed, he left a small dowry for me, and both my mother and aunt left their portions to me as well. I am far more fortunate than many." "You are very brave," he said, and took another mouthful of tea, tipping the cup right up this time. He must have drunk nearly all of it, Persephone thought. How long would the herbs she had steeped in the tea take to do their work? Lord Blaymire pushed off the window-sill and made to return to his seat, but he staggered a little sideways, his brow furrowing. "What the—" "You must be weary after your long journey, my lord." Jumping to her feet, Persephone relieved him of the cup quickly. It was part of her aunt's treasured Minton service, and she would not care to have it smashed. "Why not sit down here upon the chaise?" She clasped his elbow and led him to the leather-covered chaise along one wall, where her uncle had often reclined with a book in hand. "I don't—" But he suffered her to guide him, sitting down heavily. "I am very tired." "Rest your head a little while." She spoke soothingly, patting the chaise's padded arm. "Just close your eyes for a few minutes." "I only need a few minutes." Chapter 4. The sunlight stabbed at Samuel's eyes, and he threw his arm across them with a pained groan. "Close the damned curtains," he grumbled, before it slowly dawned on him that he was alone. Of course, he thought, he was travelling. He'd left his valet in London, not wanting to be weighed down by baggage and formality. What kind of inn was he staying in with no curtains on the window and sunlight that fell directly on the bed in the morning? His memory was oddly blank. Racking his thoughts, he found it curious that he could not recall precisely where he was, which inn, or even which town. Easing his arm carefully off his face and squinting, Samuel made out a tall, narrow window, crisscrossed with diamond-shaped lead panes, which the sunlight streamed through quite obnoxiously. I really do not recall this place at all. Placing his hand on the bed to push himself upright, he frowned as he felt leather rather than the cotton or linen of bed-sheets. Have I fallen asleep on a chaise? What bottle of hellish brew did I lose myself in last night, and why? While he had certainly overindulged more than once in his youth, it hadn't taken many occasions of waking with a sore head and a sour belly for Samuel to conclude he did not care for the after-effects of drinking to excess. Consequently, it was rare for him to find himself feeling this sick the morning after, and he could not quite account for why he should be. Sitting up with a grimace as his stomach churned, Samuel squinted around the room. It was not even a bedchamber, since there was no bed beside the leather chaise he had apparently passed the night on. Tall wooden shelves held a multitude of books, a fire in the fireplace had apparently gone out sometime during the night, and 2 chairs on either side of a small table were the only other furniture in the room. "I'm in my uncle's study at Kidnapping Tower," he realised with a sudden flash of clarity. He had taken tea with Miss Patten at that table, discussed her going to London, and after that he could remember absolutely nothing. Did she drug me with something in the tea? Patently absurd as the thought was, he tried to dismiss it, but could not. He had no other explanation for how he had been drinking tea at 3 in the afternoon one minute and waking up the next to the sight of a sunrise. Rising to his feet a little unsteadily, Samuel headed for the door. Grasping the latch, he lifted it and pulled, but the door did not move. Pushing availed him nothing either, not that he thought it would, as he could plainly see the hinges on his side of the door. There was nothing which should be impeding the door from opening, save for the black, empty keyhole he could see just below the latch. "I'm locked in." It was simply inconceivable, and Samuel wasted several minutes fiddling with the latch, impotently shoving and yanking at the door, before finally accepting the truth. Bending to put his eye to the keyhole, he could see nothing beyond, which might mean the key was in the lock, or just that the passage outside was dark, which he did recall to be the case. "This makes no sense," Samuel said to himself, beginning to lose his temper. Lifting his fist, he hammered loudly on the door. "Miss Patten, have you locked this door? You must open it at once." Nothing but silence answered him. He pounded and shouted several more times futilely. Fist beginning to ache from banging on the heavy oak, he shook it out and looked around further, trying to take stock of his surroundings, even if he could not make sense of the situation. There was another, smaller door further along the wall, and Samuel went to try it, finding, as he had suspected, that it led to a storage closet of sorts. A further door led to a tiny garderobe, with cool air breezing up through a wooden seat set over a stone hole. An ancient comfort facility, one which had been improved somewhat by the addition of a water faucet and pipe coming through the ceiling, presumably from a rainwater cistern on the roof. He might as well make use of the facility now he'd found it. He did so, and then took a look at the contents of the closet. A large box on the floor was full of cut logs for the fire, a scuttle on the shelf above held coal. There was a box of candles and a large, empty jug and ewer, which he supposed he could fill with water from the water faucet in the garderobe and drink if he had to. Returning to the study, Samuel looked around in increasing despair. The windows on the 3 outer walls were tall and narrow, impossible for a grown man to fit through, even if he was not 4 stories above the ground. Still, He went to each one and peered out. From two of the windows the sea was visible. This had, after all, been a sea watchtower for centuries, so it was hardly surprising. He could see little else save the narrow, barren strip of ground before the headland fell away to the sea. From the third window he saw the house Miss Patten had said she'd once lived in. Kinnerton Cottage, he recalled. But he also remembered she'd said it was empty, so nobody there would see any distress signal he might send. Distress signal, he scoffed at himself. You are being fanciful. This must be some misunderstanding. He just couldn't, for the life of him, work out what that might be. A sound by the door made him look over, then hurry to the door and lift the latch, jerking at it uselessly, as the door still remained stubbornly locked. Something was being pushed through the narrow gap between the door and the stone floor, though, something it took him several moments to recognise as an uncoiled rope being fed into the room. "Miss Patten," he shouted, "or whoever is out there, open this door at once. Else I shall strangle you with this damned rope when I lay my hands on you." Outside the door, Persephone winced. She had known, however, from the moment that she put the soporific herbs in the tea, that there was no turning back. She was committed to her course, and she must see it through or suffer unimaginable consequences. "Throw the rope from the window, Lord Blaymire," she said, speaking loudly to be heard through the heavy door, "and I will attach a basket for you to pull up." "Are you insane, woman?" she heard him shout, and she winced as she began to descend the stairs again. "Explain yourself." The banging and shouting receded as she reached the ground floor and trotted outside. Standing in the kitchen garden, in full view of the tower window which looked out in that direction, she waited and saw the window open and the rope begin to be let down a few minutes later. At least his rage did not blind him to reason. Or perhaps it was hunger. She had not left any food in the study. She had not dared take much time, in case she had misjudged the dosage in the tea, and he awoke. The rope reached the ground, and Persephone tied the end to the handle of the basket she'd prepared, with bread, ham, cheese, and a stoppered stone jar of ale. She rather suspected Lord Blaymire would not drink tea if she supplied it. "You can pull it up now," she shouted, and though she knew he would not be able to see her from this angle, the rope went taut, and the basket began slowly to ascend. She thought he would not be able to manoeuvre the basket through the narrow window, but he could hold it at the windowsill and empty it easily enough. "Get up here," she heard, shouted distantly, faint over the brisk sea breeze. "I want to talk to you." She most certainly did not want to talk to him. Turning away, she went back to the kitchen door, only to be intercepted by Mrs. Conkle, hands on her hips. "I don't want no part of this, Miss Patten," she said. Persephone nodded vigorously. "I quite agree, Mrs. Conkle. Indeed, were you not talking about taking Jacob on a visit to your brother's farm?" At the woman's nod, Persephone continued. "You should go. Today. Stay through Christmas at least. I'll give you both your wages until the next quarter day." Mrs. Conkle's lips tightened, and Persephone could see she was thinking it over. The housekeeper knew Persephone was up to no good, but thankfully she did not know that the man in the tower room was Lord Blaymire, who was technically her employer, since it was his money Persephone was sent each month for expenses and with which she paid the Conkles. "My brother's been asking for us to visit for a while," the housekeeper said finally. "His wife had another babe, and they could do with the help. Jacob can work on the farm. You're sure you'll be all right by yourself, miss?" "Of course," Persephone said, far too quickly. Mrs. Conkle considered her for a few minutes, and then she nodded grudgingly. "I've known you for a long time, Miss Patten, and you're no fool. I just hope you know what you're doing." "Of course." Persephone did her best to sound confident, crossing her fingers behind her back. "I shall miss you, and Jacob, of course, but I shall be quite fine, I promise you." The housekeeper said no more, though, and just walked away, going to her rooms to pack a bag. Persephone hurried to her own room to take out her money, counting out what Mrs. Conkle and Jacob were owed for the next quarter, and adding several more coins besides. Within the hour she waved the pair off as they walked down the track towards Hurstmouth, where they could board a coach to Lancaster. From there it was only a short walk to Mrs. Conkle's brother's farm. They would arrive by nightfall, and Persephone would be quite alone, save for a very angry lord locked in her uncle's study. She would have a good deal of work to do, though at least Mrs. Conkle had baked bread that morning and left a large pot of stew on the stove, which would keep Persephone and his lordship fed for a couple of days. She could turn his horse out into the field with the pony and the 2 nanny goats. There was plenty of grass, and if she saw the animal growing thin, she could always supply it with some oats or have one of the local farmers bring up some hay. Or perhaps not. Best take the cart and collect the hay herself. She did not want anyone having the opportunity to hear his lordship shouting from the tower window as he was currently doing, frantically trying to attract the attention of Jacob and Mrs. Conkle as they departed. Persephone doubted anyone had ever prevented Lord Blaymire from doing anything in the entirety of his privileged life. She found a little smirk coming to her lips as she walked back into the tower. Samuel couldn't quite believe he was having to haul a basket up to his window, like some sort of ridiculous fairy tale, only it was he who was locked up in the tower, and not Rapunzel. He couldn't even get the basket through the blasted window, and had to tie it in place before emptying the contents out onto the table. At least the food was good. Was it some after-effect of being drugged that made it so tasty? Unreasonably irritated by how good it was, Samuel nevertheless ate every last crumb. Going to the window, he replaced the empty dishes and bottle in the basket, and was preparing to lower it back down to the ground when he spied 2 figures walking away from the castle along the track he had followed coming from Hurstmouth. The man was a hulking, shambling figure that Samuel was fairly certain was Jacob, the groom from yesterday. The woman wore a plain black dress, a bonnet covering her hair, but even from the back he knew it wasn't Miss Patten. This woman was thinner, without the luscious curves of his captor. He'd worked hard to keep his eyes from lingering on Miss Patten's form, all too aware she was his ward, and he had no business thinking about her in such terms. "Hoy!" he shouted, waving his arm out the window, hoping the woman might turn around. He wasn't sure he would be able to get Jacob to understand that he needed help, much less to turn against his mistress. "Ahoy there! Help!" Neither Jacob nor the woman looked around, or gave any other indication they might have heard him, however. Though Samuel continued to shout and wave, it was not long before they passed out of sight over the headland. "Damn it all," he muttered, finally giving up and bringing his arm back inside the window, clenching his fingers and frowning when he realized how cold they were. With the window open, the room was growing cold rapidly. "I should light a fire." Staring at the grate, Samuel realized to his dismay that he had not the slightest idea how to go about cleaning the soot and ashes out and relaying a fresh fire. "At least I know the old ashes have to be cleaned out," he tried to console himself. He recalled that he had seen a pan and brush on the shelf beside the coal scuttle in the closet. He could dump the ashes down the garderobe, too. Impressed with himself for finding a solution, Samuel felt somewhat less pleased when he managed to sweep the first panful of ashes straight up into his face. Coughing, he swept a little more cautiously and soon had a mostly clear fireplace. He had lit a lade fire several times, and he tried to think about the structure. Smaller sticks laid in a lattice at the bottom with some coal atop them, then adding logs once the fire was well ablaze, he thought might do it. The fire went out twice, but finally he had a pleasant little fire blazing. Grimacing at his blackened hands, Samuel went to the garderobe to wash up. He caught a glimpse of his grey face in a small mirror on the wall and chuckled ruefully, wiping at the ash with a damp washcloth. "I have a new appreciation for the skill of the servants who lay the fires each day, at least," he murmured, adding another log to the blaze. The room was warming up nicely. Taking a restless turn about the study, Samuel supposed he might as well choose a book and try to entertain himself until Miss Patten chose to communicate with him. Frustrating as it was to have to wait on her whims, he recognized that he currently had no choice in the matter. Examining the bookshelves more closely, he found a number of books which sounded interesting. Selecting one on architecture, he took a seat by the fire. He'd just cracked the cover when an unexpected sound reached his ears, a pianoforte being played, and by an exceptionally gifted musician, if he was any judge. Arrested, Samuel lowered the book. Was that Miss Patten playing? He'd had no idea she was musical. But then, he knew nothing about her at all, really. He found himself discomforted by that. She had been his ward for the better part of a year now, and he had not written her a single letter himself, delegating the responsibility to his secretary. If he had bestirred himself, could this situation have been avoided? If he had taken the time to ask Miss Patten what she wanted, instead of deciding that bringing her to London and handing her over to his mother to launch upon society and marry off was the best way to get her off his hands. He did not recognize the music she played, and he wondered if it was of her own composition. It was a light, charming air, deceptive in its simplicity. It likely took a good deal of skill to play. After she finished the piece, she began another piece he did not know. After playing for a few minutes, she paused and began testing out chords, trying different variations on the melody. Yes, she was definitely composing. The book forgotten, Samuel could have listened to the music for hours, save that he eventually began to feel uncomfortable sitting in the hard chair. Getting up, he took a turn about the room, exploring half-heartedly. Discovering a drawer he had not previously noticed in the table, he pulled it out to find writing equipment, a stack of parchment, a bottle of ink, and several neatly trimmed pens. I should write her a note now. Apologize for not doing so before, and ask her what it is she hopes to gain by imprisoning me. There had to be something. He just didn't have the information to puzzle it out yet. Chapter 5. Taking a break from her playing at noon, Persephone went outside to see if Lord Blaymire had let the basket down again. He had, with the empty plate and jug from breakfast inside. Removing them, she discovered a note beneath. Persephone would very much rather not read the note, but she supposed she had best do so. Refilling the basket with the food she had brought before carrying everything else inside, she sat down at the kitchen table and unfolded the paper, noting to her surprise that Lord Blaymire's handwriting was thin and rather scratchy, quite different from what she had thought. He must usually have a secretary pen his correspondence. My dear Miss Patten, I cannot comprehend what exactly it is that you believe you will gain by placing us both in this situation. I am, however, quite sure that the situation shall be much more amicably resolved if you will start by telling me what you want. You cannot hope for the situation to continue for long. My mother expects me back in London within no more than a week or so, with you accompanying me, and you may be sure steps will be taken if I am not forthcoming. Let us open a dialogue, and hopefully avert any unpleasantness which will otherwise surely occur. Your friend, Samuel, Lord Blaymire. My friend! Persephone snorted, tempted to cast the note upon the fire. In a note full of threats and warnings, he calls himself my friend. Smoothing the paper out, she considered the information he had perhaps unwittingly provided her. If he was expected back in London by his mother, then Persephone needed to change that. And since he had been so kind as to provide a good sample of his handwriting, well, Persephone had always been able to mimic others' writing with an unusual degree of skill. She would spend the afternoon drafting a letter to his mother with a good reason why he should be delayed a few weeks. Perhaps he would be struck by an impulse to visit one of the more remote Blaymire holdings. There were properties in Scotland, she recalled from one of her many conversations with her uncle, including an extremely remote one on the Isle of Jura. A trip there and back could comfortably take a month. A statement that Miss Patten should be expected in London around the new year, and Persephone would buy herself enough time to make her escape. If she went into Hurstmouth and posted the letter in the morning, it should arrive in London well before Lady Blaymire began to feel concerned over her son's non-arrival, and thence head off any investigation into his whereabouts. Pleased with the idea, Persephone took the note and returned to her room, determined to master mimicking Lord Blaymire's handwriting as soon as possible. It took her all day, and many iterations thrown in the fire, before she finally had a letter she thought Lady Blaymire might believe was sent by her son. Choosing the salutation and valediction was the hardest part, but in the end she began the letter with "Dear Mother," and closed it with "Your loving son, Samuel, Lord Blaymire." Sealing the letter gave her pause too, since she had definitely seen a signet ring on Lord Blaymire's hand, with which he was likely in the habit of sealing letters. But after examining her own correspondence, she found a seal on one, purportedly from him, which had broken only around the edge, leaving the impression of the barony's seal quite intact. A little work with a hot letter knife soon had the wax transferred, and Persephone ended the day feeling quite pleased with herself, and just a little more confident that the plan she had conceived in a flash of madness the day before might just work after all. Frustrated when no answer to his note came up in either his lunch or dinner basket, Samuel spent an uncomfortable night sleeping on the leather chaise. At least he had a blanket, but the chaise was in no way long enough to fit him, and was far too narrow besides. He rolled clean off it at one point and landed on the floor, tangled in the blanket, and cursing the day he ever decided to visit Kidnapping Tower. The morning brought heavy rain, which didn't stop Miss Patten from venturing out after sending up his breakfast. He watched from the tower window as she harnessed a pony and hitched it to a neat little cart, before hopping nimbly in and driving off along the track to Hurstmouth, wrapped snugly in a thick grey cloak. I have to get her to talk to me. Thinking back on the note he had written the previous day, Samuel supposed it had been rather officious in tone, even if it had only contained truths, as he saw them. Taking another sheet of paper from the drawer, he considered carefully before penning another note. Dear Miss Patten, since you are feeding me and have ensured I have fuel for the fire, I must assume you mean me no harm, and, moreover, must plan at some point to release me. Plainly your reasons are your own, and you do not wish me to be privy to them, which is your choice. I would, however, like to request that you do me the courtesy of advising me how long you intend to keep me here. Pausing to consider his words, Samuel held his pen over the inkwell for a moment, before dipping it again and adding a few more sentences. Thank you for the impromptu concert yesterday. I enjoyed your performance immensely, though I did not recognize the piece. Is it of your own composition? I would be pleased to discuss music with you, as it is an interest of mine, if you do not wish to address other topics at this time. This time he just signed it Samuel, figuring his full name and title were far too formal for a friendly note. He winced just looking at the salutation, because he could not make it less formal. He did not even know Miss Patten's first name. That was one of the first things he would ask if he could just get her to talk to him, he decided. Or maybe in his next note, if she did not deign to respond to this one. He waited until he saw the pony cart trundling back along the track around noon, although with heavy clouds covering the sky, it was difficult to be sure, before putting the note in the basket, covering it with the checked cloth she always put over the top, and letting it back down to the ground. Miss Patten played the piano again that afternoon, and this time she stuck to more conventional pieces. He recognized Handel, Bach, and a piece he rather thought to be Salieri. All of it played with extraordinary skill worthy of a professional musician. He could not help but wonder if she might harbour ambitions in that direction, though, as a woman, she might face some obstacles if she attempted to pursue it as a career. Not least his mother, who would be entirely horrified if Miss Patten were to attempt any such thing while connected to their family. The music continued until twilight fell, which this late in the year was early in the evening. Samuel estimated the time to be around 5 in the afternoon or a little later. If today went the same as yesterday, Miss Patten would send him up some dinner around 7, after giving a sharp whistle to let him know it was time to pull up the basket. He had not bothered to rise to light a candle yet, the room lit only by the softly crackling flames in the grate. He happened to be facing the door, so a golden glow suddenly appearing through the crack at its base made him sit up sharply and take notice. "Miss Patten?" He hurried to the door. "Is that you?" There was a faint scraping sound, perhaps a stool being set beside the door, and then she said, "Yes, Lord Blaymire." "It's me." She's ready to talk. Grabbing one of the chairs from beside the fire, he carried it over to the door and sat down, thinking quickly over what he should say first. If he antagonized her, she might just get up and go, leaving him without the answers he needed. "Thank you for another concert this afternoon," he said carefully. "Your playing is truly exceptional." "Thank you, my lord." "Do you think you could bring yourself to call me Samuel? I am ashamed to admit I do not know your first name, but I should like us to be less formal with each other." The silence went on for a little while, but the glow outside the door, from a lantern he thought, did not move. Finally she said, "My given name is Persephone." He could not help a small chuckle. "How curious. I do not recall eating any pomegranate seeds, and yet I am unable to leave. Must I remain until spring comes again, then?" Samuel was relieved to hear a laugh in response, followed by, "No, not until spring." "Will you tell me your plans, Persephone? It is apparent to me that I am at your disposal, but I wonder if there is another way apart from this course you appear to have chosen." "My course is set, my lord, Samuel. I'm sorry you are inconvenienced by it." He rather thought she meant it. She did sound regretful. He was about to press her on how long she intended to hold him captive when she spoke again, cutting off his words. "Is there anything you need for your present comfort, Samuel? How is the firewood lasting?" "There is enough here for another few days, perhaps a week," he said. "I would appreciate some soap, though, and clean clothes. I doubt we could fit a bath through the window, so I must be content with washing in the ewer." "Very well. I will send up some soap, and I think my uncle's clothes will fit you well enough. Tomorrow you will need to pull up some more wood as well. I do not wish you to run low." A scraping noise alerted Samuel that she was moving, and then she said, "I will go down now and finish preparing dinner. I hope you do not mind my plain cooking." "Wait. Don't go," he said quickly. "I must, I'm afraid, else you will have no dinner, and then you will begin to rethink your assumption that I mean you no harm." He could hear her beginning to descend the steps. "Please come back and talk to me after dinner then," he shouted, hoping she could still hear him. "Or tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he heard faintly, before the dim light beneath the door faded out. Frustrated, Samuel allowed himself a small roar of rage and a bang of his fists on the door. "That was useless," he berated himself. "I learned nothing." As he calmed, however, he realized that wasn't entirely true. No, she hadn't told him her plans, but she had narrowed down the time frame. She did not plan to keep him here until spring, but it would be longer than a week, else she would not have proposed to send up more wood. And he had learned her name. "Persephone," he murmured, leaning back in his chair, seeing her face in his mind's eye, narrow and clever, her dark hair plainly arranged. She was an enigma, and a beautiful one at that. Where had she learned to play like that? What did she hope to gain by holding him hostage, for several weeks at least? How could she possibly expect to get away with it? Chapter 6. Stirring the pot of stew on the stove, Persephone sighed deeply and wiped a slightly grubby hand across her face. It had been 5 days since she'd locked Lord Blaymire in the tower, and she had avoided going up to talk to him again, her conscience troubling her intensely. At least she had the excuse of being busy, where normally Mrs. Conkle and Jacob did most of the work around the house. Now Persephone was left to manage everything herself, from milking the goats to cooking all the meals, from keeping the stove fueled to cleaning out the fires, all except the one in the study, of course. While she knew how to do everything, she had never had to manage entirely for herself before, and she found she quite resented the time it took, leaving her only an hour or so to herself to practice her music every day. "I must get used to it," she told herself stoutly, carrying an armload of split logs from the woodshed to the kitchen, silently blessing Jacob for having chopped and stored an entire winter's worth of wood there. "When I am living in America, I won't have money to waste on servants." But then, she didn't plan to have a huge house and a hungry man to feed either. A nice little cottage somewhere was her plan, ideally in a town where she might buy her bread and other supplies, and need not waste half a day once every week or so to go shopping. Pausing to stir the stew again, Persephone nodded as she saw it was just beginning to bubble, poured in another cup of water, and put the lid on. A few hours simmering and it would be ready, providing a good dinner that day, and the next too. She wanted to go and play, but another note had come down in the basket after breakfast that morning, a note which read simply, "Please come and talk to me, Persephone. I'm going a little mad from the isolation. Your friend, Samuel." Climbing the stairs, she glanced wistfully at the door to her music room, but kept on climbing, stopping at the top and taking a seat on the small stool she had left there last time. "Samuel," she called. "Are you there?" At once she wanted to kick herself for such a stupid question. Where else would he be? "I'm here." She heard his feet and the scrape of a chair as he brought it closer to the door. "How are you today, Persephone? The weather is turning cold, and I saw you outside in the rain. You must not take ill." He was being considerate, she thought, but then, if she became ill, who would feed him? "I am well, thank you. And you are not too bored, I hope?" "I am bored." He admitted it bluntly, with no attempt to minimize the truth. "But not as much as I could be. My uncle's collection of books is eclectic, to say the least. I have read several fascinating ones, and have accumulated a small pile to read next." "That's good. Again, I'm sorry." "Why?" "Why am I sorry?" "Why have you imprisoned me? I have been racking my brain, trying to understand. What is it you think you will gain, and how is it you believe you will get away with it?" She chewed on her lip, her conscience prodding at her. What harm could it do, really, to explain everything to him? He couldn't stop her from carrying out her plan, and she didn't intend to tell him of her ultimate destination. "I am almost 25, she said finally. "Indeed, but you need not worry about that. I'm sure it will not be considered by—" He cut himself off mid-sentence, surprising her. "There I go again, making assumptions. Forgive me, Persephone. You were saying." "On my 25th birthday, you will no longer be my guardian. The money my mother and aunt left me will be mine without caveat. All I need do to claim it is to attend the office of the solicitor my uncle used in Manchester." "I see." Samuel's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "How much money are we talking about? I was not under the impression you were a great heiress. Though, I admit, I did not pay close attention when my secretary mentioned the matter." "Around £5,000 altogether. Nothing of consequence on the marriage mart, certainly, but more than sufficient to live a very comfortable life." He said nothing for a minute or two, apparently thinking over what she had just said. "You already have someone you wish to marry, then?" he asked finally. "If you plan to live on your inheritance, presumably that means your intended has none, or is he threatened from being cut off if he marries you?" "How did you ever come to that conclusion?" she asked, astonished. "When did I ever suggest I had marriage on my mind?" "I beg your pardon." He sounded contrite. She wished she could see his expression. "I have a terrible habit of jumping to conclusions with you, it seems, and entirely incorrect ones." "Will you explain it to me, then?" "I plan to leave England and go to America. With my own money, I can settle quietly somewhere and live as I please. Compose my music and maybe sell it to a publisher or have it printed myself." Realizing she was saying too much, Persephone slammed her mouth shut. Samuel had heard her original music and might recognize it if he heard it played sometime in the future, using it to track her down. "America? But why? Do you even know anybody there?" "No, but why would that matter? I barely know anybody here." Feeling unreasonably annoyed that he did not understand, she sighed. "You just don't see, do you? You're a man, and the head of your family besides. Women spend our lives being told where to live, what to do, how to think, what we should want." She was shouting, Persephone realized, and she lowered her voice. "I want to choose for myself." Stunned, Samuel rested his head in his hands, wondering what to say. He wasn't sure whether to be furious, all this because she didn't want to get married, or in awe of her determination. And yes, her cleverness. Because if she could actually get to the solicitor after her 25th birthday and claim her money, she really could get on a ship and disappear far beyond the reach of any vengeance he might try and wreak for her actions. "And what, then, is your plan for me?" he asked finally. "I will leave you with supplies enough for a week at least," she said quickly. "Once I am about to board ship, I will give the solicitor a letter with instructions to open it when the ship has sailed. He will see to it that you are freed post-haste. Truly, I mean you no harm." "I see that," he agreed, a little reluctantly. "I still don't think you can pull it off, though. My mother will be wondering where I am by now, and if I am not back in London within a few days, she will be dispatching men to look for me." "No, she won't. I sent her a letter." "I beg your pardon?" Startled, Samuel snapped his head up, staring at the door, wishing for the 100th time he could see through it. "And what could you possibly have told my mother that will not have her concerned when I do not arrive home in good time?" "Oh, I didn't tell her anything. You did. I'm rather good at mimicking handwriting, you see, so I wrote her a letter from you, saying that you planned to visit Kidnapping Lodge on the Isle of Jura, and would collect me to escort me to London on your way back." "Kidnapping Lodge? How do you even know about—" "Of course, Uncle Matthew told you." Samuel groaned aloud. "He probably reminisced about summers there with my father when they were boys. My father used to talk about it often." "Exactly." Persephone sounded quite pleased with herself, and Samuel admitted it would indeed have had a fair chance at averting his mother's suspicions, save for the fact that he had sold Kidnapping Lodge just 3 months past, and his mother knew all about it. Instead of averting his mother's suspicions, the letter would have her on high alert. Samuel said nothing, though, because, after all, he was locked in a tower. "I wish you had told me in our first conversation of your ambitions to be a composer," he said gently at last. "If you do not wish to marry, I am certainly not going to force you into it, and you do not need to live on your own money. I own any number of properties where you could comfortably make your home, including this one right here if it comes to that. All you truly need to make your choice respectable is a companion, and that is easily enough obtained." "Would you truly have listened?" She sounded cynical, and Samuel supposed he could not blame her for it. He had come to Kidnapping Tower entirely confident that he knew exactly what to do with her, had dismissed her when she'd tried to tell him she didn't want to go to London. Would he have listened if he were not literally a captive audience? "I'm listening now, Persephone. You could just unlock the door and let me out. We can talk more, make a plan." There was a long moment of silence, long enough that Samuel began to wonder if she'd left, and he just hadn't heard her move. Finally, though, she said in a small voice, "I can't." "You don't trust me not to haul you off to London by the scruff of your neck, like a disobedient child, and marry you off to the first man who asks?" "You said that, not me." "I admit I'm a little tempted," he said. "But I'm not an unreasonable man, Persephone, and it seems to me that I was wrong first in not listening to your concerns, in not consulting you about your own future. I can see that you thought you didn't have any choices left, and I'm sorry about that. You're just going to have to trust me." "I can't." Her voice broke on what he was pretty sure was a sob, and then he heard her stool scrape on the stone. She really was leaving this time, he realized. "Come and talk to me again tomorrow," he said quickly. "Please, Persephone. There are other ways out of this. Just keep talking to me." "Tomorrow," she said, muffled, and then he heard her retreating down the stairs. Frustrated, wondering if he had got as close to convincing her as he thought he had, Samuel jumped to his feet and paced the room, pulling a few books off the shelves at random and slamming them back into place. One felt strange in his hand, not the usual leather and paper. He looked down at it curiously, only to discover it to be a cunningly wrought box, painted to look like a book when it was set on the shelf. "What is this?" he murmured, diverted despite his anger. Taking the box to the table, he fiddled for a moment before discovering that the spine slid up to reveal a cavity filled with folded papers. Samuel hesitated for a moment, feeling oddly as though he were intruding on his uncle's privacy, before telling himself he was being foolish. His uncle was beyond mortal cares, and everything here belonged to Samuel now. The letters turned out to be ones addressed to his aunt, from various correspondence over a period of several years. Glancing through a few and finding nothing of particular interest, Samuel was about to stuff them all back into the book-like box and return it to the shelf, when the signature at the bottom of one caught his eye. "Your loving niece, Persephone Patton." Sorting through the letters more carefully and glancing at the dates, Samuel determined that there were 4 written from Persephone to his aunt, all apparently sent during her single season in London several years before. Thinking they might help him understand Persephone a little better, Samuel lit a candle to give himself better light to see by, and began to read. The first 2 contained little information of consequence, just descriptions of places they had been, and some rather amusing pithy commentary on people she had been introduced to. The 3rd letter, however, startled him when he found what could only be a description of himself. "Dear Aunt Alice, well, we have now been in London a month complete, and you said in your last letter that I should give it that long at least before making my determination. I regret I must advise you that I am no more enamoured of our capital and her denizens today than upon our first day here. Certainly, your prediction that I would meet any number of gentlemen who would be eager to pay court to me has proved incorrect, I am sorry to advise you, though for myself I do not mind at all. We met your nephew on a second occasion yesterday, and I am pleased to report that he made a rather better impression. He is very handsome, I concede, and I was surprised to discover he is a rather good musician. He played the violin at a musicale evening, charming every young lady present. No doubt if I had not seen him in drink a few nights ago and been insulted by him, I should think myself madly in love with him today, but instead I shall say I have luckily escaped that fate. Mamma has been feeling very fatigued this last week. I think the late nights here do not agree with her. I shall encourage her to accept fewer invitations. I would not have her exhaust herself for my sake, when I cannot truly declare I have enjoyed myself at a single one of these endless balls and parties yet. While there is a pianoforte in the house we have rented, as Mamma promised there would be, it is not nearly as fine as the one at home. Just one of the many things I miss about Kinnerton, you and my uncle being two more, of course. Pray do give Uncle Matthew my love, and I hope to see you both soon, though Mamma is set on staying in London until Easter at least. I shall be attempting all within my power to persuade her otherwise. Your loving niece, Persephone Patten. Setting the letter aside, Samuel glanced over the contents of the last one on the small pile, but it was little more than a brief note stating that Persephone had called the doctor to see her mother, and they were preparing to return to Lancashire. The illness which would eventually take Mrs. Patten's life had worsened, forcing them to cut Persephone's season short. Something she had clearly not regretted. It seemed he and Persephone shared a mutual dislike for London and the ton, he thought, looking at the other letters again. She had not attempted to hide her distaste for the frenetic manner in which much of society whiled away their time, the petty gossip, and the arrogant, entitled attitudes. Attitudes he had displayed in ugly fashion, it seemed. Samuel winced to recall his own behaviour. He had lost his way after his father's death for a year or so, drowning his sorrows in drink, until his mother's despair had pulled him out of it. She had been faltering under the burden of managing the Blaymire estates alone, while Samuel did his best to drink and gamble away as much of his inheritance as he could manage. Persephone had been absolutely right to dislike him, even if she had apparently thought him handsome. A tiny ember of warmth burned in his chest at that thought, surprising him, and he found a small smile hovering about his lips. She'd liked his violin playing too, and suddenly he wanted to feel the instrument in his hands again. It had been years since he'd touched it, absorbed in his duties, but he still recalled the way he had once been able to lose himself in the music. If nothing else, having it to play might help to pass the time while he was locked in this damned tower room. "Have you ever played the violin?" Samuel asked, when Persephone returned to talk to him again the following morning. He had determined that demanding Persephone release him would only make her leave him alone again, and it wasn't merely his loneliness that made him want to avoid that. "Never," she said. "But I did learn the harp at school." "You went away to school?" A little startled, he sat more upright in his chair by the door. "Not like going to Eton." She gave a little laugh. "When I was growing up, my parents lived in Chester. There is a school for girls there I attended for several years." Not a school for the aristocracy, he surmised, more likely catering mainly to the daughters of the wealthy merchant class, with which Chester was well supplied. "And you studied music there?" "Yes." She sounded wistful. "I had been playing the pianoforte ever since I was old enough to sit upright before the keyboard, and the teachers said there was nothing more they could show me. Indeed, they said I played better than they did, but I learned the harp and the flute too. I have a flute I play sometimes, but no harp." It was on the tip of his tongue to offer to buy a harp she might play when she lived at the Blaymire townhouse in London, but he bit it back, and instead asked what else she had studied at school. The desire to know her better surprised him somewhat, but he found her genuinely interesting. More so than any pampered daughter of the ton he had met thus far, at least. Chapter 7. 5 days later. Persephone hummed to herself as she sorted through gowns in her closet, considering what she should take with her when she departed for America. She had a respectable collection of only slightly out-of-date clothes, having inherited both her mother and aunt's wardrobes on their passing. She'd already reworked many of them to suit her figure and tastes. "The ocean crossing will be cold," she murmured to herself, eyeing a heavy but warm dark blue woolen gown she was not particularly fond of. "Perhaps I could wear this one to travel." It was bulky and would take up a lot of space in her bags otherwise. Spotting a trailing hem, she tutted and folded it over her arm, planning to carry it upstairs along with her mending kit. That way she could work on it while sitting outside Samuel's door as they talked. Although Persephone had tried to stay away, she kept finding herself back at Samuel's door after breakfast every morning, eager for further conversation with him. Their conversations had ranged widely. He was a very interesting conversationalist, and Persephone regretted that it would not be long now before she would leave and their conversations would come to an end permanently. She was on her way up the tower steps, eager for their conversation to commence, when a sound from outside the tower made her freeze. Was that hoofbeats? She raced back down the stairs, flinging the door open, and to her horror saw 3 riders just drawing their horses up before the tower, 2 men in servants' garb, and a very elegantly clad lady in her later middle years. One of the men assisted the lady in dismounting, and then accompanied her to the steps, where Persephone almost clung to the doorframe. She could not imagine why Samuel was not shouting his lungs out to attract their attention. It was a pleasant day for the middle of November, and while the sky was overcast, there was little wind. The interlopers would hear him at once. "Good morning," she managed to stammer as the lady drew herself up in front of her. "Have you become lost? The track there will lead you to Hurstmouth." "I am most certainly not lost," the lady interrupted her. "I am precisely where I need to be, at Kidnapping Tower, and speaking to precisely whom I need to be speaking to, Miss Persephone Patton." Persephone blinked. "I beg your pardon, ma'am. Have we met?" The lady smiled, showing dimples in her cheeks and a bright flash in her blue eyes. She's very pretty, Persephone thought, through the panic almost choking her. "We have, but you were all of 10 years old, I think, so you probably do not remember me. I am Charlotte Mather-Curtain, Lady Blaymire." "Lady Blaymire!" Persephone's knees shook. "Indeed! I should have known you anywhere, my dear. You are the image of your mother." Lady Blaymire patted her cheek. "Now, where is my son?" I... Persephone gathered herself. "Lord Blaymire declared his intention of travelling to Scotland to inspect another of the Blaymire properties, I believe, my lady," she managed to get out. "He declared an intention to collect me on his return to escort me to London. You find me, going through my wardrobe in preparation for making the trip." She held up the gown she was still carrying over her arm, hoping that the feeble explanation might divert the lady, knowing for sure that she was about to be exposed at any moment. This was Samuel's mother. But why had he not yet alerted Lady Blaymire and her companions to his presence? "What nonsense!" Lady Blaymire said, and, to Persephone's horror, swept past her into the tower and looked around. "Samuel sold that property over the summer, along with 6 others we never had the slightest likelihood of using. I do not believe you for a moment. Frankly, I do not think he even wrote this letter." She swept a horribly familiar piece of folded parchment from a pocket of her cloak and waved it in Persephone's direction. "Now, where is he?" She looked about, as though half expecting Samuel to jump out from a darkened doorway. Persephone just stared at her mutely. "Humph!" Lady Blaymire's gaze swept over the room. "I was right. This place is quite unsuitable for you to live in alone. Is Mrs. Conkle still keeping house for you?" "Yes," Persephone said without thought, "but she is presently away visiting her brother for a short time." "You are here alone?" Lady Blaymire looked horrified. "Oh, my dear! No, we cannot have that. You must come back with me and stay in Hurstmouth. We left the carriage there and hired horses, as I recalled that track would be entirely unsuitable for a coach and 4. Obviously Samuel was here, since you have seen him. We will start our search in Hurstmouth and discover where he went next." I shall pursue him across this land until I find the dratted boy." Persephone was beginning to see why Samuel spoke of his mother in tones which combined awe and exasperation. Lady Blaymire was something of a force of nature. Her obvious good intention was undeniable, though, her concern for Persephone clear as she took her hands. Persephone almost burst into tears, hating having to lie like this to the obviously kindly older woman. "You mistake the matter, Lady Blaymire. Mrs. Conkle will be back by this evening," she lied, desperate only to see Lady Blaymire gone. "Oh, I see." Lady Blaymire tilted her head, giving Persephone an understanding look. "And I dare say it is not within your capacity to offer me some refreshments, is it?" About to indignantly disagree, Persephone realized she had almost made an enormous mistake. She attempted to look shamefaced instead. "I wish I had known you were arriving, Lady Blaymire. You find me quite unprepared to receive you." "It's quite all right, dear," Lady Blaymire said kindly. "In truth, I must not linger. I am determined to find Samuel as soon as may be, and discover exactly what is going on. I shall get to the bottom of this, mark my words." "Undoubtedly, my lady," Persephone said weakly, following in Lady Blaymire's imperious wake as she walked outside. "And then you can accompany me back to London, so finish your packing, my dear. We shall be off in a day or two, I hope." Lady Blaymire patted Persephone's cheek with another warm smile. "Indeed," was all Persephone could manage, entirely overwhelmed by panic. Lady Blaymire's man assisted her back onto her horse, and the little group rode away, Lady Blaymire pausing to wave cheerfully back at Persephone. As they rode out of sight over the headland, Persephone's breath rushed out, and her legs gave way beneath her. A moment later she was sitting on the tower steps, gasping for air after having held her breath for far too long. What just happened? Or rather, what had not happened, and why? Why had Samuel not called out to alert his mother to his presence? Lady Blaymire had 2 men with her, and Persephone was entirely alone. She could not possibly have stopped them from searching the tower and finding Samuel locked in the study. Somehow, getting to her feet, she staggered inside and up the stairs, almost clutching at the wall to hold herself up as her knees still trembled. Finally, she reached the study door and stood staring at it for a moment before collapsing to sink onto the stool. "Why didn't you call out?" She heard a deep sigh from within and knew Samuel must be sitting close to the door, waiting for her. "I almost did," he said. "And then I thought about what would happen if I did." "You'd be free by now, that's what." "And you?" She could not even imagine. "Probably locked up in your place while you sent one of the men to find the magistrate," she said, after a moment of silence. "If my mother had anything to say about it, maybe," Samuel said. "Following which, she'd probably have you committed to Bedlam." Miserable, Persephone winced. "I dare say it's nothing more than I deserve." "Or married to me." Startled, she almost toppled off the stool. "What?" He sighed again. "I have been alone here with you for 10 days, Persephone. And even though both you and I know there has been a locked door between us for all but a few minutes of that time, if I did not permit you to be sent to Bedlam, and I would not permit it, for you are clearly not insane and do not deserve such terrible treatment, then my mother would tolerate no other outcome than our immediate marriage." Persephone just sat with her mouth open, heart pounding. I she stuttered finally. "She'll be back, Persephone. It's not going to take her long to find out I haven't been seen since leaving Hurstmouth. You're lucky my horse was grazing in the hollow at the bottom of the hill, else my men would have recognized him, and the jig would be up already." He was right. She knew it. She just didn't know what to do. If she left now, she wouldn't have enough money to get herself to Manchester and stay somewhere until her birthday, when she could claim her inheritance. She could only manage until then because she had Kidnapping Tower as a roof over her head and the ability to send all the bills for food and supplies to the Blaymire steward in London. And Samuel knew exactly where she would be going anyway. There was no escape. "I don't know what to do," she said in a small voice. "I suspected this day might come, so I've been thinking," he replied. "And I have a plan. You're going to have to trust me, and you're going to have to come to London and play your part for a short while at least. But I promise, Persephone, I'll help you achieve your dreams. In America or here, wherever you choose to live, I'll make sure you have access to your money and the means to live independently without having to rely on your own resources." He sounded sincere, but how could she tell? He would say anything to get her to unlock that door, surely. Persephone leaned her aching brow against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. "What's your plan?" she asked finally. "You let me out of here, and I saddle my horse, head north across country, and take a room in the next town I come to," he said promptly. "Mother will find me tomorrow or the next day at the latest. I'll claim I'm on my way back from Scotland to collect you, and we'll proceed from there."
"But she said you'd sold the Scottish property. You didn't mention that when I told you what I'd put in the letter."
"I didn't," Samuel agreed. "You're clever enough to have sent another letter, with some excuse about me having been in my cups and forgotten the sale, with another trumped-up reason for my extended absence. I knew my mother would be alerted by the letter, I admit."
"Which is what you wanted, of course."
She could hardly blame him for that. "And that excuse, incidentally, is the one I planned to give Mother. I got drunk, forgot I'd sold Kintarrick Lodge, and was halfway to the border before I sobered up and remembered. I'll tell her I went to Carlisle and stayed with an old school friend there for a few days instead, before returning." It's a good plan, Persephone thought. A workable, believable plan, if she trusted him to carry it out. But she didn't see that she had much choice. Samuel looked up in surprise as the key grated in the lock. The door creaked slowly open to reveal Persephone standing there, wearing a heavy grey woolen gown which did her pale complexion no favours. He made no attempt to rise, even though he was reasonably confident he could get to her before she could close the door again and overpower her easily. If he did that now, he would lose her trust permanently, and he didn't want that. "Why?" she asked, those stormy eyes boring into him. "Why would you do that for me after what I've done to you?" "Because I wronged you first. Oh, not the insult I dealt you long ago when we met in London, though that was egregious enough. No, the wrongs I have been continuously heaping on you these last months since my uncle's passing, from the moment I determined I was too busy to attend his funeral and see to your welfare myself. Every letter I have ordered my secretary to send, every order I casually issued and expected you to follow." She was staring at him, incredulity written all over her face. "I locked you up." Her voice was a thin whisper. "I drove you to the point of thinking you had to flee the country to escape." Samuel spread his hands wide. "I've had plenty of time to think these last few days." He offered her a wry little smile. "The fact that you're going to have to come to London and play nice with my mother for a few weeks at least is sufficient punishment for your decision to lock me up, as far as I'm concerned." Finally, Persephone entered the room, fumbling her way to the other chair, where she slumped into it and sat staring at him. "I do not suppose I have any other choice." "You do," Samuel disagreed immediately. "If you truly wish it, you can claim your inheritance and depart for America as you planned." She looked ever more shocked. "You would allow me to do that?" "Yes. But I hope that you will not." I would forever feel I had not done right by you, would always worry if you were doing well, worry if you were happy and safe. Be honest with me, Persephone. Freedom is what you truly desire. You have just believed until now that America was the only place you could obtain it. Do you really want to sail far across the ocean to a strange land where you don't know a soul? It is a vast risk to take, especially travelling with a hefty sum of money. I will be sick with worry over you until I hear of your safe arrival." Persephone took a deep breath, fished a handkerchief from her pocket, and dabbed at the corners of her eyes. Samuel hoped heartily that she would not cry. A woman's tears had always had the power to bring him entirely undone. "You should hate me," she whispered. "Perhaps on the first or second day in here, I did. After you explained your reasons to me, I found I could not," he said with searing honesty. "I deserve your hatred, but if you will agree, perhaps we can both set the past aside and begin anew." "In London," she said slowly. "For a little while. Just long enough to placate my mother." He gave her a wry smile. "You met her. Is it not obvious that she is exceptionally poor at taking no for an answer?" Persephone choked out a small laugh, and he nodded encouragingly. "Stay with us through Christmas, Persephone. Take the time needed to make your decision about where you want to live. Allow me to set things up so that you are safe and comfortable wherever you wish to be. Even here, if you wish, though I cannot countenance you living here, or anywhere else, with so few servants as you have been." Her lips twitched, and she laughed properly. "None, you mean? At least for the last week?" "Definitely far too few." He smiled back at her. "A housekeeper and a man-of-all-work is a good start, but also a housemaid or two and a companion, someone you can talk to, perhaps someone else who enjoys music. Would that be so bad?" "It sounds positively idyllic." She fixed her stormy eyes on him, expression serious. "If you are willing to pretend I didn't lock you in here, then obliging you by spending a few weeks in London with your mother is the least I can do." "Very well. It is decided, then." Samuel nodded. "You had best summon your housekeeper to return as soon as possible. If she is not here when Mother and I arrive back to collect you, questions might be asked that you would prefer to avoid." Persephone nodded. "If you are going to go north to the next town and wait there for Lady Blaymire to find you, that is Lancaster, some 10 miles away. Mrs. Conkle is staying with her brother an additional 2 miles from there. Perhaps you could send a messenger on to her with a note from me." "Of course. Write it while I gather my things and catch my horse. I take it Jacob stored his tack in the garden shed." Within the hour, Samuel was swinging up onto his horse's back and trotting away from Kidnapping Tower, heading north, away from the track leading to Hurstmouth. He had a map Persephone had drawn which would guide him to Lancaster in his pocket, along with a note for Mrs. Conkle requesting her immediate return to Kidnapping Tower. Though it was starting to drizzle, Samuel turned his face up to the sky and smiled, relieved to be free and out of doors again at last. His jail had been about as comfortable as it was possible to be, but freedom still tasted exceedingly sweet. Before he lost sight of the tower entirely, he turned in his saddle. Even at this distance, he could still make out Persephone standing in the doorway, watching him go. She was brave to trust him, though the truth was, she had little choice. Still, he was glad she had seen it his way. His mother returning to find him held as Persephone's prisoner could not have ended well for her. Now, he just had to convince a suspicious and annoyed Lady Blaymire that the story he had cooked up was the truth. But first, to find a comfortable inn and obtain a hot bath, something he was desperately in need of after 10 days washing in a basin with cold water from a rooftop cistern. Chapter 8. London. 8 days later. Persephone peered from the carriage window as it slowed. Though dark was falling, she could see that they were turning into a large square lined with elegant houses with a small park in the centre, now empty of those who might frequent it during the day. "Grosvenor Square," Lady Blaymire said from her seat opposite, and Persephone jumped. The Baroness had been drowsing for much of the afternoon. Though they had made the journey from Lancashire at an easy pace, it had still been a long, wearying week of travelling in increasingly cold and wet weather. Samuel had spent a few hours each day riding in the carriage with them, but to his mother's displeasure he spent at least as much time riding outside on his horse, no matter the weather. Enjoying his freedom, Persephone silently surmised, though of course she could not say as much. She must try and forget that she had ever held Samuel hostage in Kidnapping Tower, for nothing good could come of anyone knowing about it. "Home at last," Lady Blaymire said with a contented sigh as the horses clattered to a halt. A moment later, a footman opened the door, letting down the step and offering a hand for Lady Blaymire. Persephone followed in the older woman's wake, looking about wearily. Dark was falling fast, but warm, welcoming light glowed in the windows of the elegant townhouse before them. Samuel was ahead of them, standing in the doorway speaking with the butler, as a groom led his horse around to the mews behind the house. Moments later the carriage rattled away too, leaving Persephone standing alone on the edge of the street, watching. Samuel saw her, came down the steps and smiled, offering his arm to escort her. "You must be exhausted, Miss Patten. Please, allow me to escort you inside. Welcome to Blaymire House." She swallowed nervously. Samuel had played his part to perfection ever since he and Lady Blaymire had returned to Kidnapping Tower 2 days after Samuel had ridden away. Samuel had even advised her quietly that he had written a letter to his friend who lived in Carlisle, and he was confident his friend would swear that Samuel had paid him an unexpected visit and stayed for a few days. Their ruse had worked, to fool Lady Blaymire at least. Walking up the steps on Samuel's arm, Persephone squared her shoulders, telling herself sternly that she could play her part too. It's only for a few weeks, she thought. Samuel had promised. Though she really had to stop thinking of him as Samuel, because sooner or later she would slip. So far as the rest of the world, and most importantly Lady Blaymire knew, they barely knew each other and had spent only a scant few hours in each other's company. Samuel had been careful during the evenings of travel as the three of them dined to ask innocuous questions of her, many of which she knew he already had the answers to. They'd had to pretend to get to know each other all over again, except this time they had to limit themselves to the trite exchanges which were all that polite society would permit. "Mrs. Jones will show you to the Bluebell chamber," Lady Blaymire said as Persephone entered the hall, and a plump, kindly-faced woman in a smart grey woolen dress and apron bobbed a curtsy. "No, the Daffodil Suite, Mother," Samuel said. Lady Blaymire startled, staring at him. "I beg your pardon, my dear." "The Bluebell chamber is everything charming, but I would like Miss Patten to have the Daffodil Suite." His tone was quite final. Lady Blaymire nodded in immediate acquiescence. "Mrs. Jones?" She looked back to the housekeeper. "Half an hour, my lady, and I'll have a fire roaring in there, and fresh linens on the bed," Mrs. Jones said immediately. "Perhaps the young lady would care for tea." Persephone thought a hot cup of tea sounded heavenly, and promptly said so. The housekeeper beamed at her. "Come to my rooms, and we'll have tea together while the Daffodil Suite is being readied for you, my dear." Lady Blaymire took her hand. "We'll soon have you settled in and feeling quite at home." Suddenly, Persephone felt guilty and foolish for having made so much fuss. Lady Blaymire had been nothing but kind and welcoming to her. Was it really so much to ask for Persephone to attend her in London for a few months? "We shall go through the stack of invitations which have no doubt accumulated in my absence decide which events will be best for you to make your society debut, and discuss all the eligible gentlemen you'll meet," Lady Blaymire said gaily as she swept Persephone up the stairs. Oh God! Persephone felt sick at the very thought. Glancing back over her shoulder, she caught Samuel's commiserating expression. He can't help me. We're both in the same boat. His mother's expecting him to find a wife, just as she's expecting me to find a husband. At least she wouldn't be suffering alone. Samuel looked as though he relished the coming activities no more than she did, and the thought gave her comfort as she tried to tune out Lady Blaymire's excited chatter. 2 weeks later. Persephone collapsed back onto her bed with a sigh, feeling the thick goose-down-filled comforter sink beneath her body. Gazing up at the yellow silk hangings of the canopy above her bed, she felt miserably ungrateful that she wasn't enjoying herself. "Let me get your slippers, miss," her maid said, and a moment later she was tugging at Persephone's dainty evening slippers, silver silk embroidered with tiny crystals and pearls, a match to her stunning ball gown. "Are your feet sore? I've a basin of warm water with salt and lavender here for you to soak them." Tears pricked at the backs of Persephone's eyes. Every thoughtful gesture such as this, for she knew Lady Blaymire would have left instructions for the footbath to be ready on their return, just made her feel more guilty. "Thank you, Sally," she said, pushing herself wearily to sit up on the edge of the bed and setting her feet into the basin. The water felt blissful on her tired, aching feet. Sally knelt on the bed behind her to begin unbuttoning her gown. "Did you dance every dance, miss? Lady Blaymire's pleased as punch that you're so popular with the gentlemen, I hear." Lady Blaymire made sure Persephone was never without a dance partner, that was certain. The woman seemed to know everyone in London, and she had a vast circle of friends, all of whom seemed pleased to introduce their son, nephew, brother or grandson to Lord Blaymire's ward for a dance. Quite a few of the gentlemen seemed pleased enough with Persephone to follow up the dance with a morning call afterwards too, though the truth was she found she had little to say to any of them. They didn't seem to care, taking her silence as encouragement to rattle on about their own interests, telling her about their estates, horses, dogs, or, in the regrettably memorable case of Mr. Elwood, his collection of carved walking sticks. Persephone sighed glumly as she thought of Mr. Elwood, who had spent the last dance that evening treading on her feet as he'd enthusiastically described his latest purchase, an ebony walking stick with an ivory handle carved in the shape of a mermaid. He had promised to call in the morning and perhaps walk with her around Grosvenor Square and show her the stick, if the weather was not too cold. She could feel her eyes glazing over at the mere thought. 4 balls, 4 dinner parties, 2 evenings at the theatre, dozens of calls paid and received, and every single morning spent being poked and prodded at as the most exclusive modistes in London prepared her a whole new wardrobe. She had barely a minute to herself, and certainly none to so much as touch a key on the beautiful pianoforte which sat, lid closed, in Blaymire House's elegant front parlour. "Are you still awake, miss?" "Yes." Persephone blinked her eyes open, startled to realise she was lying down on the bed again, her feet still in the basin of warm water. Sally had removed her gown, stays and chemise and pulled a fresh nightgown over her head. "Barely." She managed a smile for the maid. "You need to sit up again, miss, so as I can take the pins out of your hair." Sally gestured apologetically. "Else you'll be stabbing yourself in the night." She barely had the energy to push herself upright, her head nodding as Sally gently removed each pin, unwound the complicated arrangement of plaits she had put up a few hours earlier, and made a simple braid which trailed down over Persephone's shoulder. "Into bed with you and sleep, miss. You've a busy day tomorrow." Another one. Persephone sighed as she laid her aching head on the pillow. How she wished to be back at Kinnerton Tower, with only the wind soughing across the moors and Samuel for company. Though, of course, If she was back at Kidnapping Tower, she would not have Samuel for company. Her eyes popped open. Why, when I could be wishing for absolutely anything, am I wishing for Samuel's company? It did not take her long to perceive the answer. He's the only man I've ever met who's asked me what I want from life and listened to my answers. And he's not even one of my potential suitors. I wish he was. It was her last thought before her eyes slid closed again and sleep claimed her. Chapter 9. A tap on the study door arrested Samuel in the middle of pouring himself a snifter of brandy. Grimacing, he set the decanter down. "I've probably had enough to drink tonight anyway," he muttered before raising his voice. "Enter." He knew who it had to be, of course. Who else would be desirous of conversation with him at 3 a.m? Lady Blaymire entered the study with a light step and a smile on her face, looking just as fresh as she had when they'd left the house hours earlier. "What a delightful evening," she trilled, scooping up the brandy glass from in front of Samuel and taking a sip before seating herself and smiling at him. "And what a remarkable success Miss Patten has proved to be. Why, she danced every dance tonight. Again." "Because you introduced enough eligible gentlemen to her to claim dances enough for 5 balls," Samuel said dryly. "Pshaw!" An elegant hand dismissed his remark. "None of them were under any obligation to ask her to dance. Certainly, none of them need have paid morning calls upon her, and we have been positively inundated." He knew. Only too well. Most of the callers had brought flowers, expensive hothouse blooms, bright in the gloom of a London winter. They were all over the house, wafting exotic scents every time he breathed. "Now, if only you were doing so well," Lady Blaymire said pointedly. "I am doing perfectly well, Mother." With a glance at the purloined brandy in her hands, he reached for another glass. "You have not so much as stood up to dance with Lady Elizabeth St. Clair since we returned to town." There was nothing he could say to that because it was perfectly true. Despite Lady Elizabeth presenting herself to his notice at every event they had both attended, albeit in an extremely subtle and genteel way, he had just found himself unable to summon the fortitude to engage with her. She hadn't seemed to mind, gladly chatting with anyone who wished to talk to her, accepting dances from multitudes of eager swains, after casting brief glances at Samuel to see if he would wish to step in first, of course. "Samuel?" "Lady Elizabeth is your choice, Mother," he said, turning back to look at her. "And since I am the one looking for a wife, I'm afraid I need to make the choice." Lady Blaymire made a little moue, but then shrugged. "She's so perfectly suitable for you, my dear. But if you have taken a fancy for some other lady, you need only say so. Your title might not be as high as some, but the barony dates back to the Norman Conquest, and the coffers are comfortably full. Not to mention you are perfectly personable. Any lady short of a royal princess should be delighted to be your wife." "You make me sound rather like a horse you plan to put up for sale," Samuel said wryly. 15 hands high, good conformation, excellent teeth, only the best bloodlines." His mother spluttered, but he could see the laughter in her eyes. "Samuel! Outrageous!" She leaned across to smack his hand lightly. "You will note that I did not describe any of the ladies on the marriage mart thus, I hope." "Indeed," he conceded. "The point is, dear boy, that there is no reason why any lady you esteem might not return your regard. All you need to do is make your preference known." She stared at him, one eyebrow cocked. The silence dragged out. "Samuel?" He finished his brandy and set the glass down on the desk. "You have not actually chosen anyone, have you?" He sighed and admitted the truth. "In the last 2 years, I have met any number of perfectly nice young ladies." Some, like Lady Elizabeth, would be considered suitable in every possible way, from beauty and fortune to family connections and impeccable manners. But I'm not buying a horse, which I may exchange for another at any time it suits me. I'm choosing a wife. Someone to spend my life with, to mother my children, and I want more. I want what you and Father had, a happiness in each other's company. To be of one mind in everything." His mother's expression softened when he spoke of his father, but she surprised him by laughing. "Is that how we seem to you, darling? Goodness me, no. We most certainly were not of one mind in everything. We both had our own interests, our own friends, too. While I agree it is good to share some things, I am not persuaded a marriage of living in each other's pockets would be entirely healthy." Samuel stared. His mother pointed at the brandy decanter. "If we are having this conversation, I think you'd better pour us both a little more of that." He obeyed, a little befuddled as he thought back over what he knew, or thought he knew, of his parents' marriage. "There are obvious pitfalls to avoid when looking for a spouse," his mother began. "If you have a true passion, of course it is a bad idea to choose someone who despises it." "Which is exactly why I do not think Lady Elizabeth St. Clair and I would suit," Samuel said. "She loves London and the whirl of the social season, commented to me more than once that she is glad her parents very rarely choose to spend time at their country estates, as she does not like to rusticate, as she put it." "Ah!" Lady Blaymire nodded, understanding flooding her expression. "Whereas you attend parties of more than 4 friends upon sufferance only, and would far rather be at Blaymire Castle than anywhere else in the world. Well, I am glad to see you eliminated her as a possibility based on rational considerations." "I would have made her miserable." Quite. Sipping her brandy, Lady Blaymire nodded at his desk. "Take one of those sheets of blank paper, dear, and make a list. Let us consider the attributes you wish for in a wife. I would suggest that she must be capable of moving in society, but by no means addicted to it. What say you to that?" "A distinct preference for the country over London," Samuel added, reaching for paper as his mother commanded, though he did not pick up a pen. "Does not mind crumbling old castles?" Lady Blaymire's eyes twinkled, and he laughed. "She should not require me to dance attendance on her, but I would like her to enjoy my company." "Well, she must then be well educated enough to converse with you on a wide range of topics, if it will often be just the two of you, else you will quickly be bored with each other." Samuel could not help his thoughts flying back to Kinnerton Tower. Even separated by a locked door, he had thoroughly enjoyed his conversations with Persephone, who was obviously well-read and intelligent. They had spent an entire afternoon discussing Othello, which was apparently her favourite Shakespeare play. "That reminds me," he said. "Is Othello playing anywhere in London at the moment?" His mother looked at him curiously. "What made you think of that, dear?" "I do not know, I must say, but I imagine you will find details in the newspapers if you would like to see it." He did not dare tell her that he would like to take Persephone to see the play. His mother would leap on that tidbit like a hungry cat leaping on a mouse. Samuel needed to remember that Persephone did not want a husband. She wanted peace and space, and a place to compose her music where she need not be bothered by the demands of society. Instead, he set his empty brandy glass on the desk and rose to his feet, bidding his mother a good night in tones which made it clear their conversation was at an end. Sitting back down again, he looked at the sheet of paper where he had definitely not written a list enumerating all the qualities he would like in his future wife, and where he would not. Because the truth was, he'd already met the woman who embodied all of those qualities, and many more. A beautiful, determined, clever woman who didn't want to marry at all. Was it possible for him to change her mind? convince her that she could have everything she wanted, and marriage. He would never go back on his word to help her realize her dreams, even if she rejected him. He would assure her of that, but he did think she liked and respected him, at least. Perhaps he had a shot at convincing her that marriage to him would be worthwhile. He was so desperately, hopelessly in love with her that he couldn't let her walk away without trying anyway.
"Sorry to wake you, miss, but you need to get up and dressed."
Slowly, Persephone blinked open eyes which were gummy with sleep. The angle of the sun falling across her bed from the curtains Sally had just thrust open told her she had not slept nearly as long as she would like. "What the?" she mumbled. "Why?" The question was a miserable whine, and she knew it.
"I'm that sorry, miss, but you need to get up and dressed. There's a delivery coming into your private sitting room."
Since the private sitting room was separated from her bedroom by an archway with no door in it, that meant whoever was making the delivery would be able to see into her bedroom, Persephone realized. Which meant she really did have to get up. With a groan, she pushed herself upright. What delivery? She frowned at Sally, who beamed back at her, far too cheerfully for someone else who had also been up so late. But then Sally could have napped during the evening, while Persephone had been out having her toes stepped upon.
"It's a surprise his lordship ordered for you,"
Sally exclaimed, grasping Persephone's nightgown and jerking it up to pull it over her head.
"Sent his man special to order it the first day you arrived in London, he did, and it's just now ready for delivery."
Left with little choice but to go along with the maid's inexorable determination to get her decently dressed, Persephone suffered herself to be put into a morning dress, her hair brushed and coiffed, while another maid set her bed to rights. Then she followed Sally into the private sitting room of the Daffodil Suite, decorated in the same pretty yellow and white colour scheme as the bedroom. Sally scurried to open the double doors, which led out to the landing, and immediately there was a commotion outside, the shuffling of booted feet and male grunts. Her curiosity roused, despite her grumpiness at having been woken so early, Persephone stood beside the mantel and stared as 4 men shuffled their way into the room, carrying something large and obviously heavy, draped in a large cloth. But the shape! It could only be... Her hand came up to cover her mouth. He didn't," she whispered. "Is that—" "Your own pianoforte." Samuel's eyes crinkled with his smile as he followed the men into the room and directed them where to place the instrument. 2 more men followed with another large cloth-draped item. "And a harp, too." "A harp?" Tears welled in her eyes at his thoughtfulness. Only once had she mentioned to him that she knew how to play a harp, had learned at school. That he had thought to buy her one, had, if Sally was correct, ordered both it and the pianoforte as soon as they'd arrived in London, overwhelmed her. "Oh, Sam, Lord Blaymire, you are too generous." Hastily she covered her slip. "Thank you so much. You cannot know what it means to me to be able to practice again. If your mother allows me the time to do so, that is." "I believe I do understand, at least a little," he said, surprising her. "It is your influence which has inspired me to pick up the violin again for the first time in years, and while I am a little rusty, I am finding great enjoyment in playing again. Perhaps you would permit me to play with you at some time. Possibly you could teach me some of your original compositions." She could hardly speak, entirely overwhelmed. A piano bench was being carried in now and set up before the instrument, a tuner following, to prepare both the harp and pianoforte for use.
"Maybe some tea while you wait for it to be tuned, miss,"
Sally suggested tentatively, and she nodded. "Will you sit with me?" she asked Samuel. "It is a racket while the piano is being tuned, but I find I do not wish to let it out of my sight." Samuel laughed, but then he nodded. "I would be pleased to keep you company while you wait. Yes, Sally, tea would be very nice, and perhaps you should bring some breakfast for Miss Patton as well." Persephone could not contain her excitement. Her hands shook as she sipped her tea, and though she did eat at Samuel's urging, afterwards she could not recall a morsel of what had passed her lips. At long last the tuner declared himself satisfied with the 2 instruments, and took himself off. Samuel held out his hand, gesturing for her to take a seat and try out her pianoforte. It was a genuinely beautiful instrument, one which must have cost a good deal. With the first press of her fingers on the keys, notes rang out, clear and true. Chapter 10. It took Persephone less than a minute to lose herself in the music, and forget he was even there. Samuel quietly took a seat, observing from the corner of his eye the maids lingering in the bedchamber, their busy hands for once still, as they listened to the music with dreamy eyes. A movement at the door heralded the arrival of his mother, a startled look on her face. He held a finger to his lips to hush her, and she nodded in understanding, coming into the room on silent feet and taking a seat of her own. "Well, this is remarkable," she whispered. "Did you know she could play like this, Samuel?" "I heard her play on my arrival at Kidnapping Tower the first time," Samuel whispered back, stretching the truth slightly. "It was obvious how important music is to her. I thought this would please her." "Very thoughtful of you." His mother gave him an approving nod, followed by a speculative look. "This is why you wanted her to have the daffodil suite, of course, even though it would normally be reserved for your bride." "Well," she said, when Samuel looked away, refusing to meet her gaze, "no doubt when this gets out, she will have even more eager suitors. Gentlemen do like a musical spouse." Calling Persephone musical was very much underselling her, but Samuel knew his mother was already suspicious of his emotions. So he said nothing, sitting back in his chair and letting his eyes drift to half-mast as he allowed himself to relax, losing himself in enjoyment of the music. It was over an hour later when Persephone finally lifted her hands from the keys for more than a moment. At once his mother began to applaud, startling Persephone, who obviously had not the slightest notion her audience had expanded. From the faint sounds he could now hear out on the landing, Samuel suspected half the household staff had gathered outside to listen too. "Marvellous, my dear! Quite magnificent! We have been invited to a musicale at the Staffages tomorrow. I had planned to decline as they can be quite deadly dull, but we must go, and you shall exhibit." His mother beamed as she rose from her chair and drifted over to the pianoforte. "You have quite a gift, Persephone." "Thank you, my lady," Persephone mumbled. "Do you sing too?" "I should much rather not." "No matter." His mother waved it away. "Your playing is more than exquisite enough to put any other young lady to shame." "I should much rather not do that either, my lady," Persephone said, her expression a little desperate. Samuel winced at the realization that yet again, despite his best intentions, he had managed to put Persephone in an awkward position. "Enough, mother," he said quickly, going to join them and placing a hand on his mother's arm. "I did not give Persephone the instruments as a birthday gift so that you might browbeat her into exhibiting herself." "A birthday gift?" his mother asked, and Persephone echoed the words, her storm-grey eyes wide. "Your birthday is tomorrow, Miss Patton," Samuel said gently. "Or did you forget? You can be quite forgiven for doing so, since I know my mother has kept you far too busy to keep track of such inconsequential things as the date." He winked at her. From her expression, he gathered she had indeed lost track of the date. "This is far too extravagant a gift," she said quietly, her fingers caressing over the keyboard, too gently to press any keys. "Nevertheless, they are yours to keep. Wherever you may eventually reside," he added, and he saw her eyes widen as she took his meaning. that no matter where she chose to set up her home, he would ensure the instruments would be at her disposal. "How very generous of you, Samuel!" his mother exclaimed. "No doubt Persephone's future husband will be delighted her dowry includes such beautiful instruments. You will be able to teach your own daughters to play on them, my dear." "Daughters?" Persephone said faintly. "And sons, if you wish, of course, if they show an aptitude for music. Samuel got his from his father. Sadly, I haven't a musical bone in my body." His mother laughed her merry, tinkling little laugh. "I do appreciate listening to it, though, especially when played with such skill as you possess. Which is why I do think that the Staffages Musicale tomorrow—" "Let us instead ask Miss Patten what she would like to do tomorrow," Samuel cut his mother off again, "since it is her birthday." His mother gave a small pout, but she also nodded, conceding his point. Samuel didn't doubt that she was probably mentally reviewing the invitations she had received to determine where best to have Persephone display her skills, but for now she waited patiently for Persephone to voice an opinion. "Well," Persephone said in a small voice, looking at him hopefully, "I had very much hoped to. That is, I have read so much about and always thought that I should like to go to Astley's amphitheatre." "The amphitheatre!" his mother cried. "Why, I have not been there since Samuel was yet at Eton. What a capital notion, Persephone! Indeed, we should go. Let us put together a party of friends. Samuel, I leave it to you to arrange a box for us, and Persephone and I shall decide who to invite." Persephone shot him a look that said she knew very well who would be deciding what, but there was amusement in it. Samuel smiled back at her. "A box at Astley's it shall be, then, Miss Patten. And I pray, tell cook your favourite dishes, and have her prepare them for dinner. We take birthdays quite seriously in this family, you will find." "Uncle Matthew used to say that too," she murmured. "Because it is a family tradition," he insisted. "Let us celebrate with you, Miss Patten. And today, Mother, you are to leave Miss Patten to her own devices. Let her have the day to acquaint herself with her new instruments. Come, let us leave her in peace." He ushered his mildly protesting mother towards the door, but then paused just before exiting when Persephone said his name in a soft voice. "Yes, Miss Patten." "If you would like to bring your violin up," she said, meeting his eyes, a breathtaking smile on her face, "I should be delighted to play with you." "You may not be once you hear me play. I am still on the rusty side," he warned, but he felt quite ridiculously pleased that she had asked. "Nevertheless," she said pertly. "After luncheon, perhaps. This morning I have a box at Astley's to arrange." He winked at her before closing the door behind him, leaving her to the solitude he suspected she craved. The music began again before he had taken so much as a single step away. Laughing softly and feeling inordinately happy that he had managed to get the pianoforte and harp delivered in time for her birthday, Samuel headed downstairs with a spring in his step. Astley's amphitheatre. Persephone could not remember ever having had such a delightful day. 2 days, in fact, ever since she'd awoken yesterday to find the beautiful new instruments Samuel had bought for her. She had played all day, pausing only to eat and drink when her maid brought her regular trays, as ordered by Lady Blaymire, Persephone was sure. Samuel had indeed returned in the afternoon with his violin, and proved to be not nearly as rusty as he had claimed. They'd whiled away 2 enjoyable hours playing together, Lady Blaymire joining them and requesting all her favourite pieces. They'd gone out to dinner, but it had been a small, intimate affair with another family who lived on Grosvenor Square. Persephone had been a little surprised to find she was thoroughly enjoying herself. With such a small audience, and no eligible gentleman present save Samuel, she'd allowed herself to be persuaded to play, and had delighted the company after dinner. Today Samuel had surprised her again, this time by escorting her to visit the British Museum, where they'd been given a wonderful tour by one of the curators. Afterwards they'd gone for tea and cakes at Gunter's, then returned to Grosvenor Square to change, collect Lady Blaymire, and eat a light dinner before departing again for Astley's. Persephone did not think she would have liked to be down in the crowded lower stalls so close to the exhibition ring, but Samuel had arranged a box for them with a wonderful view, and they were quite comfortable, not squeezed in at all. An older couple, Sir George and Lady Harrington, friends of Lady Blaymire, were the only ones who joined them. "I admit, I did not think you would like this sort of entertainment," Samuel noted to Persephone at the conclusion of one of the acts, a remarkable display of 8 horses and their riders dancing a country dance to music. Applauding enthusiastically, Persephone turned a shining smile in his direction. "I never said I hated everything about London, Lord Blaymire. It has wonderful amusements and attractions such as this. It is only the crush of people that I do not care for, and the sensation that one is constantly on display, being scrutinized for the slightest misstep." "That is exactly how I feel about it," Samuel agreed. "A few weeks in town here and there is pleasant enough. Visits to the opera and the museum, spend a little time with friends, but then I wish to be in the country again, at Blaymire Castle, with the clean country air in my lungs, and company only if I choose to seek it out." "You have not told me much of Blaymire Castle, Samuel." She said his name quietly, since Lady Blaymire was chatting loudly with the Harringtons, and unlikely to overhear. "Even when we had more time for private conversation. I should like to hear more about it. Lady Blaymire mentioned something about restoration works." "It is a border castle in Shropshire dating to the 13th century, Samuel said. "Or parts of it do, at least. Generations of my ancestors have built onto, improved, knocked down and re-engineered it so much, I do not think much of the original remains. A true Theseus ship, if I do say so." Persephone laughed, but she was truly interested in the castle, especially since she could see the genuine passion which entered Samuel's expression when he talked about his home. He spoke of his ambitions to add modern plumbing, of the kitchen which had just been rebuilt to include 2 fine modern ranges, of the tenant farmers who tended the rolling acres surrounding the castle. "And when do you plan to return to the castle?" she asked when he paused for breath. "Oh, in the new year, I suppose. Mother prefers to only leave London in the height of summer, but I would like to be back at Blaymire well before Easter." He looked at her thoughtfully. "If you have not determined your final plans by then, perhaps you would like to accompany me to Shropshire, visit the castle. Even if you decide to return to Kinnerton Tower to live, you would always be most welcome in my home." "Return to Kinnerton Tower?" Lady Blaymire exclaimed. Obviously she had caught those words, and now leaned towards them, her expression horrified. "Why ever would you consider returning there, Persephone? Indeed, you must not. You must stay in London with me until you find a husband." Persephone was just about to declare she had no intention of marrying, and now that she had passed her birthday and was in control of her own fortune could do whatever she wished, when she took in Lady Blaymire's expression and paused. Samuel's mother had been nothing but kind to Persephone. Yes, she had made assumptions about what Persephone wanted for her future, but it was obvious her heart was in the right place. That she wanted Persephone's happiness, even if she thought the only path for that happiness involved catching a suitable husband. And really, a traitorous little part of Persephone's mind pointed out, it's not such a terrible thought, is it? Even though Lady Blaymire's idea of what constitutes a suitable husband may be rather different from mine. A husband like Samuel would be a dream come true, in truth. A kind, generous man who shares many of my own interests. Intelligent, and so very, very handsome. She sneaked a glance at him, leaning over and pointing to draw his mother's attention to the act now entering the circus ring below, gallantly pulling Lady Blaymire's attention away from Persephone. But Samuel wasn't for the likes of her. Persephone had met Lady Elizabeth St. Clair, the Marquess's daughter, who was widely considered the front-runner for Samuel's hand, and she knew she was absolutely no competition. Lady Elizabeth was beautiful and gracious, well-bred and utterly poised. Persephone doubted even a strand of Lady Elizabeth's golden hair had ever so much as strayed out of place. Whereas, despite Lady Blaymire's best efforts and the expenditure of a good deal of Samuel's money, Persephone still felt like a fraud in her new silk gowns. Lady Elizabeth's parents would probably throw a ball for her birthday. Certainly, she wouldn't have asked to come to Astley's amphitheatre to watch performing horses and a pantomime. Samuel laughed aloud then, turning to Persephone with a broad grin on his face, pointing to the performers in the ring, and her feelings of inadequacy subsided a little. At least Samuel was enjoying himself, a lot more than he would at a ball, she was sure. She smiled back at him, a little comforted by the thought that she wasn't entirely wasting his time. Still, tomorrow she must write to the solicitor in Manchester and begin the process of accessing her funds so that she could set up her own household. Though Samuel had offered her Kidnapping Tower, Persephone thought that honestly it might be a little too remote for her liking. Perhaps she might look for a small house in Chester, find a companion. Take on some musically inclined pupils to teach if she wanted more company or money. Tomorrow, Persephone thought, laughing at the antics of the actors in the ring below them. I'll write tomorrow. Chapter 11. What is this? Persephone stopped playing, startled, as Samuel strode into her sitting room. I beg your pardon. This. He waved a folded, sealed letter she recognised at once. That is the letter I wrote this morning for my solicitor. Lady Blaymire told me I should leave any letters on the salver in the hall for you to frank. Was that incorrect? Yes. No. That's correct. What I want to know is why. She just stared at him, bemused, and he threw up his hands. A foolish question. The only reason you would write to your solicitor is to instruct him regarding the disposition of your funds, but you do not need to, Persephone. I thought we had come to an understanding about this. Anything you need, I am more than happy to provide. He looked truly upset, she thought, and she tried to explain. You have said that, Samuel, and I truly appreciate your kindness, but I cannot impose upon you forever. Impose? He stared at her as though thunderstruck. My kindness? Good God, you have not the faintest idea, do you? She frowned, confused as to what he might mean. About what? He crossed the room to her in swift strides, discarding the letter somewhere along the way, falling to his knees beside her at the piano bench. I have been in love with you, I think, since the day you took your future into your own hands and locked me up in your tower. In love with your spirit and tenacity, your gentle heart and your musical soul. A ringing had set up in Persephone's ears, and her vision darkened at the corners. Do not faint, she ordered herself sternly. This was no time to faint, because if she did, she might miss some of the wonderful, incredible things Samuel was saying. I know you crave time and space to devote yourself to music, he said, and I promise you shall have all you need, and more, but let me show you how much more there could be for you. Let me take you to Paris, to Berlin and Vienna, to meet with the great composers. Let me help you publish your music, to share it with the world as it deserves to be shared. I will found a publishing company for you if you want. Only tell me that you might perhaps find it in your heart to return some small degree of the affection I hold you in. She laughed through the tears that were fighting to escape her eyes, leaned forward, and took his dear, handsome face between her hands. Samuel, all I ask is a room in your beloved castle for my pianoforte. And you, His hands came up to cover hers, and she realized they were trembling. "Persephone," he said, softly, questioningly, his expression wondering.
"I love you too," she told him plainly. "But I never thought. I locked you in a tower."
"I'm glad you did," he exclaimed. "For if you had not, I should undoubtedly have ridden roughshod over your wishes, never listened to your hopes and dreams, never come to know you." Turning his face, he kissed her palms, one after the other. "I might never even have had the opportunity to listen to you play. Never be sorry for locking me in your tower, my love. Indeed," he broke out in a roguish grin, "perhaps we should honeymoon at Kidnapping Tower, and you can lock me up again, but this time lock yourself in with me." Laughter bubbled up inside her, and she let it spill out.
"You will never let me forget that, will you?"
"I shall be proudly telling our grandchildren how you and I first met, and warning our grandsons never to settle for a lady who would not lock them in a tower if they were trying to ride roughshod over her wishes."
"And ensuring our granddaughters have convenient towers at hand?"
"There are several at Blaymire Castle. They can have one each, and I shall build more if required," he declared, laughing too.
"Not one man in 1,000 would be able to laugh about having been locked up in a tower," Persephone said, still hardly able to believe it. "And not one in 10,000 could have fallen in love with their jailer."
"None of them could be so lucky as to be imprisoned by a beautiful woman who plays like an angel." Samuel rose to his feet, drawing her to stand up with him. "I vow to you now, Persephone," he said softly, fervently, "I shall never try to determine what is best for you without first asking you what you actually want."
"You would not dare," she told him pertly. "You know what I am capable of."
"I do, my beautiful, brave, slightly criminal beloved." He was looking at her in a way that made Persephone's knees tremble and her stomach feel strangely hot. She found her breath coming quickly, and her face grew flushed. "Persephone." Samuel said her name, his voice low and husky, and she leaned towards him instinctively.
"Samuel."
He touched her cheek, brushed a dangling curl away from her eye, and she realized his fingers were shaking too. He was just as nervous as she, Persephone suddenly comprehended.
"I think you should kiss me now,"
she blurted out, which made him laugh again. "You are, as usual, entirely correct." He leaned in closer, warm breath brushing her lips, and Persephone let her eyes drift closed. The kiss was everything she might have dreamed it to be, and more. She melted against Samuel, who curved his arms about her protectively, holding her as tenderly as if she were made of finest china.
"Dare, I hope," a voice said behind them, "that this means you have convinced Persephone that she need not flee to the wilds of Lancashire merely to escape us, Samuel."
Persephone emitted a small shriek and tried to leap back, but Samuel held her close against him, turning his head to look over his shoulder. "You may be the first to congratulate us, Mother. Persephone has agreed to make me the happiest of men."
"Marvellous!"
Lady Blaymire clapped her hands together, smiling broadly.
"Took the pair of you long enough to recognise that you were perfect for each other, I must say."
"I beg your pardon?" Samuel blinked, and Persephone was sure her own face reflected similar astonishment.
"Quite unexpected, but I've seen the way the pair of you have been looking at each other ever since we returned to London. Really, Samuel, I have married 6 of your sisters off happily. Do you truly think I do not know a love match when one is taking place right in front of me?"
Lady Blaymire snorted magnificently.
"We shall make the announcement at the Christmas ball, Samuel, which, in case you had forgotten, is tonight, so do not keep Persephone too long. She needs to prepare herself."
"We have been managed once again," Samuel said, into the silence which fell once Lady Blaymire had swept from the room, and Persephone finally gave in to her laughter and collapsed, giggling wildly, against his chest. Several hours later, Samuel stared in awe as Persephone descended the stairs to join him, a soft, loving smile on her face. Dressed in a silvery silk gown with tiny pearls stitched about the neckline and her dark hair perfectly arranged, she was every bit the beauty he had suspected she might be when he first saw her in a dull woolen gown at Kidnapping Tower. The silvery gown brought out the stormy grey of her eyes as she laid her hand on his and gazed up at him. "Are you ready?" he asked her seriously. "This is your last chance to cry off, you know. You could still claim your money and flee to the Americas. I would not stop you, though you would break my heart if you did." "You shall not be rid of me so easily," she declared, a teasing light coming to her eyes. "If you do not marry me, you will have to marry Lady Elizabeth St. Clair and spend your life dancing attendance on her here in London." Samuel's full-body shudder of horror was entirely unfeigned. "I have to save you from such a ghastly fate, you see." Reaching up, Persephone kissed his cheek. "And, of course," she whispered, "I am quite desperately in love with you, besides." He would much rather have swept her back up the stairs and spent the evening alone with her, listening to her play, perhaps stealing a few more kisses. But knowing his mother and the rest of society were waiting on their appearance, aware, too, that he and Persephone could choose how frequently to subject themselves to this kind of public experience in future, he took her hand on his arm and led her into the ballroom. The end. Thank you for listening to Kidnapping Lord Blaymire. Written and narrated by Catherine Bilson. Copyright 2021. Audiobook production copyright 2022. For more of my work, please visit my website at catherinebilson.com.